The canyon walls rose like ancient sentinels around the Apache village of Redstone Creek, their sandstone faces carved by centuries of wind and rain into shapes that seemed to watch, to judge, to remember. In the shadow of those walls, where the morning mist clung to the sagebrush like spirits reluctant to leave the earth, a young woman sat perfectly still on a flat boulder overlooking the valley below. Her name was Ayana, which meant eternal blossom in the tongue of her people. Though on this dawn she felt anything but eternal. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The beaded leather of her dress caught the first pale rays of sunlight filtering through the canyon's mouth. Each bead had been sewn by her grandmother's weathered fingers, every pattern telling a story of their bloodline, their victories, their sacred connection to the land that stretched endlessly beyond the red rock formations. But today, those same beads felt heavy as chains, weighing down her shoulders with the burden of expectation, tradition, and a future she could not bear to imagine. Below her, the village stirred to life with the familiar rhythm that had governed her people for generations beyond counting. Smoke began to curl from the cooking fires, threading gray ribbons into the crystalline morning air. Women emerged from their wickiups with clay vessels balanced on their hips, heading toward the creek that gave their settlement its name. Children's laughter echoed off the canyon walls as they chased each other between the dwellings, their feet kicking up small clouds of red dust that sparkled in the growing light. Ayana watched it all with eyes that held too much knowledge for her 20 winters. She knew every face in that village, every story, every scar earned in battle or blessing received from the spirits. This was her world, her people, her blood. Yet today, for the first time in her life, she felt like a stranger looking down from a great height at a life that no longer belonged to her. The sound of approaching footsteps on the rocky path behind her made her shoulders tense. She didn't need to turn to know who climbed toward her morning sanctuary. Only one person in the village moved with that particular combination of power and deliberation, each step placed with the careful authority of a man who had led their people through war, peace, famine, and abundance for more seasons than most could remember. "My daughter." The voice of Chief Nalnish carried the weight of mountains, deep and resonant, tinged with both love and an immovable firmness that had guided their band through the darkest of times. "The sun rises and you are not in your place." Ayana's fingers tightened around the smooth stone she had been holding, a piece of turquoise her grandmother had given her before crossing to the spirit world. "The sun rises whether I watch it or not, Father. My presence changes nothing." Chief Nalnish moved to stand beside the boulder where his daughter sat, though he did not climb up to join her. Even in this moment of fatherly concern, he maintained the subtle distance that his position demanded. He was not just her father. He was the keeper of their people's survival, the bridge between the ancient ways and the harsh realities of a world that grew more dangerous with each passing season. "Your presence changes everything, Ayana. You know this." His gaze followed hers across the valley, taking in the peaceful morning scene that belied the tensions gathering like storm clouds on the horizon. "Matu arrives today." The name fell between them like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples of dread through Ayana's carefully maintained composure. Mata, the grizzly war chief of the northern band, a man whose reputation for both courage and cruelty had spread across the territories like wildfire. A man 30 winters old, scarred by countless battles, respected by warriors and feared by enemies. A man who had asked for her hand in marriage, and whose request could not be refused, without risking the alliance that kept both their peoples safe from the encroaching white settlements and the cavalry patrols that grew bolder each month. "I know," Ayana said quietly, her voice barely audible above the morning breeze that stirred the sage. "I have known since the moon was full." Then you understand why you must prepare yourself. Why must you accept what the spirits have chosen? For you. Ayana finally turned to look at her father, this man she loved more than life itself, whose strength had sheltered her through childhood and whose wisdom had shaped her understanding of the world. His face, weathered by sun and wind and the weight of leadership, showed the strain of the past weeks. The lines around his dark eyes had deepened, and she could see the silver threads that had begun to weave themselves through his black hair. Like early frost on prairie grass, the spirits chose this? She asked, and there was no defiance in her voice, only a profound sadness that seemed to age her beyond her years. Or did fear choose it? Did necessity choose it? Did the knowledge that Mato's warriors are strong and our enemies are many choose it? Chief Nalnish was silent for a long moment, his eyes studying his daughter's face as if memorizing it. When he spoke again, his voice carried a weariness that spoke of sleepless nights and impossible decisions. Sometimes, my daughter, there is no difference between what the spirits choose and what we must do to survive. The white soldiers grow bolder. The settlers push further into our hunting grounds each season. The northern band has horses, weapons, warriors. Together, our peoples can stand against what comes. Apart. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Ayana had grown up hearing the stories of tribes that had stood alone against the tide of expansion, had listened to the tales of villages found empty, their people scattered to the winds or worse. She understood the mathematics of survival, the cold calculations that leaders like her father had to make when the future of their people hung in the balance. I know, she said again, and this time her voice cracked slightly, revealing the young woman beneath the composed facade. I know why it must be. But knowing and accepting, they are different things, Father. Chief Nalnish stepped closer to the boulder, his large hand reaching out to rest gently on his daughter's shoulder. The gesture was both tender and final, a father's love constrained by a leader's duty. Matu is not a cruel man, Ayana. He is hard, yes, as the times require. But he has spoken well of you, has promised to honor you as befits the daughter of a chief. Honor. Ayana repeated the word as if tasting something bitter. He has seen me 3 times, Father. 3 times in formal gatherings where I sat silent while the men spoke of war and treaties and the movement of game across the territories. He knows nothing of my thoughts, my dreams, my fears. He honors the idea of me, the alliance I represent. Not me. The truth of her words hung in the air between them like smoke from a dying fire. Chief Nalnish could not deny what she said, could not pretend that this marriage was anything more than a political necessity dressed in the customs of their people. Yet he also could not change the reality that made such necessity unavoidable. Perhaps, he said carefully, in time, understanding will grow between you. Perhaps you will find in him. What, Father? Ayana's voice sharpened, though she kept it low enough that it would not carry to the village below. A companion? A partner who sees me as more than a symbol of our alliance? A man who will value my counsel as you have valued mother's before the fever took her. The mention of her mother brought another silence, heavier than the first. Ayana's mother, Itzel, had been more than Chief Nalnish's wife. She had been his closest advisor, his partner in both the intimate decisions of family life and the complex negotiations that governed tribal politics. Their marriage had been arranged too, but over the years it had grown into something deeper, a true partnership that had made them both stronger. Your mother, Chief Nalnish said slowly, was also reluctant when our fathers arranged our union. She told me years later that she had planned to run away the night before our ceremony, to lose herself in the mountains rather than bind herself to a man she barely knew. Ayana looked up sharply, surprised by this revelation. She never told me this. There were many things your mother kept to herself, wisdom she shared only when the time was right. She did not run, Ayana. She chose to stay, to trust that the spirits work in ways we cannot always see immediately. And in time, double quotes, his voice softened with memory. In time, what began as duty became something neither of us had expected. But what if it doesn't? The question burst from Ayana like water breaking through a dam. What if Matu remains a stranger? What if I spend my life as nothing more than a symbol of peace between our peoples, a living treaty with no voice, no choice, no freedom to become what I might have been? Chief Nalnish studied his daughter's face, seeing in her features the echo of the woman he had loved and lost, the fierce intelligence that had made Itzel such a formidable partner. Ayana had inherited more than her mother's high cheekbones and expressive eyes. She had inherited her quick mind, her independent spirit, her refusal to accept simple answers to complex questions. "What would you have me do?" he asked quietly. "Tell Mato that the daughter of Chief Nalnish will not honor the agreement made in good faith? Risk the anger of the northern band? Watch our people face the coming troubles alone?" Ayana slipped down from the boulder, her moccasined feet landing silently on the red stone path. She stood before her father, this man who had taught her to read the signs in nature, to track game through the forest, to negotiate with traders who came to their village. He had raised her more like a son than a daughter in many ways, had encouraged her quick mind and strong will. Now that very strength worked against them both. "I would have you remember," she said, her voice steady despite the tears that threatened, "that Mother used to say the spirits gave us choices for a reason. That wisdom sometimes means knowing when to bend and when to stand firm. That's survival. Without freedom is just another kind of death." Before Chief Nalnish could respond, the sound of approaching horses echoed off the canyon walls. Multiple riders, moving at a steady pace that spoke of purpose rather than urgency. Both father and daughter turned toward the sound, though they could not yet see the riders approaching along the winding trail that led to their village. "They arrive early," Chief Nalnish observed, his voice returning to the formal tone of leadership. "Mato brings a larger party than expected." Ayana closed her eyes briefly, feeling the weight of her fate settling around her shoulders like a blanket of snow. When she opened them again, her father was watching her with an expression that mingled love, regret, and an unwavering resolve. "I will not shame you, father," she said quietly. "I will not shame our people. But neither will I pretend to joy I do not feel. That is all I ask, my daughter. That is all any of us can ask in these difficult times." Together, they began the walk back down the path toward the village, where the normal rhythms of morning life were beginning to shift as word of the approaching riders spread. Women emerged from their tasks, children were called to their mothers' sides, and the village's warriors began to appear with their weapons, not from hostility but from the ceremonial respect due to visiting war chiefs, preparing and narrating. This story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. As they walked, Ayana felt each step taking her further from the life she had known and closer to a future she could not yet comprehend. The turquoise stone in her hand grew warm from her grip, and she found herself whispering a prayer her grandmother had taught her, words meant to give strength in times of great change. The village that had seemed so peaceful from her vantage point on the boulder now hummed with purposeful activity. Cook fires were stoked higher in preparation for a feast. The finest blankets were brought out to honor their guests. Elder women who served as witnesses to important ceremonies began to appear in their ceremonial dress, the silver and copper ornaments that marked their status catching the strengthening sunlight. Young warriors painted their faces with the symbols of welcome, while older men gathered in the council circle to prepare for the formal discussions that would accompany this visit. Everything moved with the practiced efficiency of a people who understood the importance of ceremony, of showing proper respect to allies whose goodwill might mean the difference between life and death in the uncertain times ahead. Ayana watched it all with eyes that saw both the beauty of her people's traditions and the inexorable machinery of fate closing around her. Each preparation was another step toward a moment she could not undo, a choice that would define the rest of her life. Yet beneath her resignation, something harder began to take shape, a resolve as sharp and unyielding as the obsidian blades. Her people used for their finest work, the sound of horses grew louder, accompanied now by the voices of men calling greetings in the northern dialect. Soon, very soon, she would stand before Matu and speak the words that would bind her to him, would seal the alliance that would keep both their peoples safe from the storms gathering on the horizon. But as she walked toward that moment, Ayana found herself thinking not of submission or duty, but of her grandmother's stories about the ancient times, when the people had first learned to ride horses, when they had discovered that survival sometimes required not just adaptation, but transformation. Sometimes the old woman had said, "The spirits put you in an impossible place not to break you, but to show you that you were stronger than you knew." The first rider appeared at the canyon's mouth, a scout bearing the northern band's colors. Behind him came others, and among them, unmistakable even at a distance, rode the man who would become her husband before the sun reached its peak. Motu, the grizzly, whose reputation preceded him like thunder before lightning. Ayana straightened her shoulders, feeling the weight of the beaded dress and the deeper weight of responsibility. Whatever came next, she would meet it as the daughter of Chief Nalnish, as a woman of the people, as someone worthy of the strength her bloodline had passed down through generations of survival and adaptation. The morning sun climbed higher, burning away the last wisps of mist that had clung to the sage, revealing the day in all its harsh clarity. Today would end with a ceremony, with vows spoken and alliances sealed. But what it would begin, what might grow from this moment of sacrifice and necessity, remained written only in the hands of the spirits and the choices yet to be made. Dust cloud announcing Mato's arrival settled like a brown shroud over the village entrance as his war party came to a halt before the ceremonial gates. Ayana stood with the other women of the village, positioned according to her rank as the chief's daughter, watching as the northern band warriors dismounted with the fluid grace of men born to the saddle. Their horses, magnificent animals with coats that gleamed like polished copper and midnight, stamped and snorted, sensing the tension that crackled beneath the surface of the formal welcome. Matu himself was exactly as Ayana remembered from their brief previous encounters, yet somehow more imposing in this setting, surrounded by his chosen warriors and bearing the full weight of his authority. He stood a full head taller than most men, his broad shoulders draped in a war shirt decorated with scalp locks and painted symbols that told the story of his victories. Scars traced silver lines across his arms and chest, each one a testament to battles survived, enemies defeated, honor earned through blood and courage. His face was carved from the same unforgiving stone as the canyon walls, all sharp angles and weathered planes that spoke of a man who had never known softness, never allowed himself the luxury of doubt or hesitation. When his dark eyes swept over the assembled villagers, taking in the preparations made for his arrival, they lingered only briefly on Ayana before moving on, as if she were merely another element of the ceremony to be acknowledged and then set aside. That glance, brief as it was, told Ayana everything she needed to know about her future husband's regard for her. She saw assessment in those eyes, calculation, the look of a man evaluating a horse or a weapon for its usefulness rather than its intrinsic worth. There was no cruelty in that gaze, but neither was there warmth, curiosity, or any hint that he saw her as more than a necessary component of the alliance he had come to secure. Chief Nalnish stepped forward to greet his guest. The two leaders, clasping forearms in the traditional gesture of respect between equals. Their voices carried across the village as they exchanged the formal words of welcome, speaking of journeys safely completed and hospitality freely offered. Behind them, Mato's warriors began the process of establishing their temporary camp, their movements efficient and disciplined, betraying none of the weariness that should have accompanied their long ride from the northern territories. "Welcome, War Chief Mato," Chief Nalnish intoned, his voice carrying the weight of genuine respect despite the personal cost of this alliance. "Our village honors your presence. Our fires burn bright for you and your warriors." "Chief Nalnish," Mato replied, his voice a deep rumble that seemed to resonate from the depths of his chest. "The northern band rides far to seal the bonds between our peoples. Let the ceremonies begin, so that what was spoken in council may become truth beneath the eyes of the spirits." The formal exchange complete, both leaders turned toward the gathered villagers, their gazes inevitably finding Ayana among the women. This was her cue to step forward, to present herself as the bridge between their two bands, the living symbol of unity that would bind their warriors together against common enemies. Ayana moved with the careful grace her mother had taught her, each step measured and deliberate, her beaded dress catching the light with every motion. She could feel the weight of dozens of eyes upon her, measuring her worthiness, her composure, her ability to fulfill the role that had been chosen for her. Among those watching were the elder women of her own village, many of whom had known her since birth, who had helped raise her after her mother's death, who now looked upon her with a mixture of pride and sorrow. When she reached the appropriate distance from the two chiefs, Ayana stopped and performed the traditional gesture of acknowledgement, her hands moving in the ancient patterns that spoke of respect, submission, and acceptance of the path the spirits had laid before her. The movements were as familiar to her as breathing, practiced countless times in preparation for this moment, yet they felt strange now, as if she were watching someone else perform them from a great distance. "Matu of the Northern Band, Chief," Nalnish said formally, "I present my daughter Ayana, whose name means eternal blossom, as we have agreed. She comes to you with honor intact, with the skills befitting a chief's daughter, with the blessing of our ancestors and the promise of alliance between our peoples." Matu studied her openly now, his gaze traveling from her face to her posture, to the quality of her dress and ornaments. Ayana forced herself to remain still under that scrutiny, though every instinct screamed at her to flee, to run back to the canyon rim where the morning had seemed full of possibilities instead of this suffocating certainty. "She is pleasing," Mato said finally, as if commenting on the quality of a particularly fine blanket or set of weapons. "The alliance is acceptable. Let the ceremonies proceed." That was it. No words of greeting directed to her, no acknowledgement of her as a person rather than an object to be acquired. Ayana felt something cold and hard settle in her chest, a bitter understanding that whatever hopes she might have harbored for finding even tolerance in this arrangement had been naive beyond measure. The rest of the morning passed in a blur of preparations and rituals. The village women, led by the Council of Grandmothers, began the process of preparing Ayana for her wedding ceremony. They led her to the special lodge that had been constructed for this purpose, its walls hung with the finest blankets and its floor carpeted with soft furs that had been gifts from hunters seeking her father's favor. Inside the marriage lodge, the transformation began. Elder women who had known Ayana's mother took charge of the preparations, their weathered hands gentle but inexorable as they began the process of readying her for her new life. They stripped away her everyday dress and replaced it with the ceremonial garments that had been worked on for weeks by the finest seamstresses in the village. The wedding dress was a masterpiece of their people's artistry, crafted from the softest deerskin and decorated with thousands of tiny beads arranged in patterns that told the story of her lineage. The colors, deep blues and rich reds, bright yellows and pristine whites, caught the light filtering through the lodge's smoke hole and seemed to pulse with life of their own. Silver ornaments that had belonged to her grandmother adorned her throat and wrists, while her hair was braided with ribbons and feathers that spoke of her status as a chief's daughter. As the women worked, they spoke in low voices of their own marriages, their own struggles to find happiness or at least peace in unions arranged by necessity rather than choice. Some shared stories of love that had grown slowly over years of shared hardship and mutual respect. Others spoke more honestly of accommodations reached, of dignity maintained through compromise and careful navigation of powerful men's expectations. Marriage, said Ayana's great-aunt, Running Wolf, as she carefully painted traditional symbols on Ayana's face, is not always what the young imagine it should be. But it is also not always what the young fear it must be. Men can surprise you, child, given time and patience. And if they don't? Ayana asked quietly, her voice barely audible above the soft sounds of preparation around her. Running Wolf's hand paused in its work, the older woman's eyes meeting Ayana's in the polished metal mirror that served for their reflections. Then, you learn to survive, to find happiness in small things, to remember that no situation lasts forever. Your grandmother used to say that women are like water. We find a way around obstacles that would break stronger things. Outside the marriage lodge, the sounds of the village's preparation continued. Drums began to beat in the steady rhythm that would accompany the ceremony, while the voices of the singers started the ancient chants that called upon the spirits to bless the union about to take place. The aroma of cooking food drifted through the lodge walls. The wedding feast was already being prepared, with the finest game and the most precious stores being used to honor their important guests. Ayana closed her eyes and tried to imagine herself somewhere else. Tried to pretend that when she opened them, she would be back on the canyon rim watching the sunrise, with the whole day spread before her like an unwritten story. But when her eyes opened, she saw only the concerned faces of the women preparing her for a future she couldn't escape. "Tell me about him," she said suddenly, addressing the room in general. "Not the war chief, not the alliance maker. The man. Does anyone know anything about Motto the man?" The women exchanged glances, some uncomfortable with the directness of the question, others understanding the desperate need behind it. Finally, an older woman named Singing Bird, who had married into their village from a band that had dealings with the northern peoples, spoke up. "I knew his first wife," she said carefully. "White Dove, her name was. A good woman, strong, skilled in all the women's arts. She died 3 winters ago in the fever sickness that swept through their territory." "Huh? Did he treat her?" Ayana pressed, hungry for any information that might help her understand what her life was about to become. Singing Bird considered her words carefully. "He was not unkind to her, from what I heard. Distant, perhaps, as many men are with women they see as separate from their warrior concerns. But he provided for her well, protected her, gave her honor befitting her position. She bore him no children, which grieved them both, but he never blamed her for it openly or put her aside for a more fertile woman. It wasn't much, but it was something." Ayana clung to the image of this white dove, this woman who had lived with Matu and apparently found a way to endure, if not thrive. If she could do it, perhaps Ayana could as well. Perhaps there was a way to navigate this marriage that would preserve some core of herself, some private space where her true thoughts and feelings could survive. The sound of horses approaching at speed interrupted her thoughts. Through the lodge walls came the sound of urgent voices, men calling out in excitement rather than alarm. Ayana and her attendants froze, listening as the commotion grew closer. "Riders approaching from the east," someone shouted. "White men, but flying a flag of truce." The women looked at each other with expressions ranging from curiosity to concern. White settlers rarely came this deep into Apache territory, and when they did, it usually meant trouble of one kind or another. For them to arrive on the day of an important wedding ceremony seemed like either remarkable coincidence or very poor timing. Running Wolf moved to the lodge entrance and peered out through the hanging that covered the doorway. 3 riders, she reported. One carries what looks like a military flag, but they're dressed like civilians. They're requesting an audience with your father. Ayana felt her heart begin to race for reasons she couldn't entirely explain. Something about this unexpected arrival felt significant, like a stone thrown into still water, that would send ripples spreading in all directions. She found herself hoping, though she couldn't say for what exactly, that these strangers might somehow change the course of events that seemed so fixed and inevitable. Should I? She began, but running Wolf shook her head firmly. No, child. This is not women's business, and certainly not bride's business. Your place is here, preparing for your ceremony. Let the men deal with whatever brings these white men to our village today. But even as she nodded obediently, Ayanna found her. Attention drawn to the sounds filtering in from outside, the steady approach of horses, the low voices of men in discussion, the sense that something unexpected was about to unfold. For the first time all day, she felt a flutter of something that might have been hope, though she dared not examine too closely what she hoped for. The wedding preparations continued around her, the women's hands steady and sure as they completed the transformation that would mark her passage from maiden to wife. But Ayanna's mind was elsewhere now, caught between the ceremony that awaited her and the unknown possibilities represented by these unexpected visitors. Outside, she could hear her father's voice raised in formal greeting, could hear Mato's deeper tones joining the conversation. Whatever business had brought the white men here would be concluded quickly, she knew. Nothing would be allowed to interfere with the alliance ceremony that had been planned for so long and meant so much to both. Their people's survival, yet as the final touches were applied to her ceremonial appearance, as the last ornaments were placed and the last prayers whispered over her preparation, Ayanna found herself listening not to the wedding songs beginning outside, but to the unfamiliar voices of the strangers whose arrival had disrupted the careful order of her wedding day. The transformation was complete. In the polished metal mirror, she saw not herself but the perfect image of an Apache bride, beautiful, serene, ready to fulfill her destiny as the bridge between two peoples. But behind the painted symbols and beneath the magnificent dress, her heart hammered with the rhythm of wild horses running free across an endless plain. The three white men who rode into the village, clearing dismounted with the careful movements of people who understood they were vastly outnumbered and completely at the mercy of their hosts. Their leader, a tall man with sun-weathered skin and prematurely gray hair, held the truce flag steady as he approached the circle where Chief Nalnish and Mauto waited with their respective councils of warriors and elders. From her position inside the marriage lodge, Ayanna could hear fragments of the conversation that began to unfold in the village center. The white man's voice carried clearly in the desert air, speaking in heavily accented but comprehensible Apache, his words careful and respectful in a way that suggested previous experience dealing with her people. "Honored Chief Nalnish," the stranger said, his voice carrying the weight of genuine urgency beneath its diplomatic tone. "I am Captain Samuel Morrison, formerly of the United States Cavalry, now representing the territorial government in matters of delicate negotiation. I come seeking your wisdom in a matter that concerns both our peoples." Chief Nalnish's response was measured, cautious. "Captain Morrison, your arrival on this day is unexpected. We are in the midst of sacred ceremonies. Perhaps another time would be more appropriate for whatever business brings you so far from your settlements." "I understand, Chief, and I would not interrupt such important proceedings if the matter were not urgent. 3 days ago, a wagon train carrying families seeking new homesteads was attacked some 20 miles east of here. 7 people were killed, including 2 children. The survivors claim it was Apache raiders." The words hit the gathering like a physical blow. Ayanna could hear the immediate tension in the voices that responded, the anger and denial that rose from both her father's warriors and Mato's men. She pressed closer to the lodge entrance, straining to hear every word of this conversation that had so suddenly changed the atmosphere of her wedding day. The wedding dress was a masterpiece of their people's artistry, crafted from the softest deerskin and decorated with thousands of tiny beads arranged in patterns that told the story of her lineage. The colors, deep blues and rich reds, bright yellows and pristine whites, caught the light filtering through the lodge's smoke hole and seemed to pulse with life of their own. Silver ornaments that had belonged to her grandmother adorned her throat and wrists, while her hair was braided with ribbons and feathers that spoke of her status as a chief's daughter. As the women worked, they spoke in low voices of their own marriages, their own struggles to find happiness or at least peace in unions arranged by necessity rather than choice. Some shared stories of love that had grown slowly over years of shared hardship and mutual respect. Others spoke more honestly of accommodations reached, of dignity maintained through compromise and careful navigation of powerful men's expectations. "Marriage," said Ayana's great-aunt, Running Wolf, as she carefully painted traditional symbols on Ayana's face, "is not always what the young imagine it should be. But it is also not always what the young fear it must be. Men can surprise you, child, given time and patience. And if they don't?" Ayana asked quietly, her voice barely audible above the soft sounds of preparation around her. Running Wolf's hand paused in its work, the older woman's eyes meeting Ayana's in the polished metal mirror that served for their reflections. "Then, you learn to survive, to find happiness in small things, to remember that no situation lasts forever. Your grandmother used to say that women are like water. We find a way around obstacles that would break stronger things." Outside the marriage lodge, the sounds of the village's preparation continued. Drums began to beat in the steady rhythm that would accompany the ceremony, while the voices of the singers started the ancient chants that called upon the spirits to bless the union about to take place. The aroma of cooking food drifted through the lodge walls. The wedding feast was already being prepared, with the finest game and the most precious stores being used to honor their important guests. Ayana closed her eyes and tried to imagine herself somewhere else. Tried to pretend that when she opened them, she would be back on the canyon rim watching the sunrise, with the whole day spread before her like an unwritten story. But when her eyes opened, she saw only the concerned faces of the women preparing her for a future she couldn't escape. "Tell me about him," she said suddenly, addressing the room in general. "Not the war chief, not the alliance maker. The man. Does anyone know anything about Mado the man?" The women exchanged glances, some uncomfortable with the directness of the question, others understanding the desperate need behind it. Finally, an older woman named Singing Bird, who had married into their village from a band that had dealings with the northern peoples, spoke up. "I knew his first wife," she said carefully. "White Dove, her name was. A good woman, strong, skilled in all the women's arts. She died 3 winters ago in the fever sickness that swept through their territory." "Huh. Did he treat her?" Ayana pressed, hungry for any information that might help her understand what her life was about to become. Singing Bird considered her words carefully. "He was not unkind to her, from what I heard. Distant, perhaps, as many men are with women they see as separate from their warrior concerns. But he provided for her well, protected her, gave her honor befitting her position. She bore him no children, which grieved them both, but he never blamed her for it openly or put her aside for a more fertile woman. It wasn't much, but it was something." Ayana clung to the image of this white dove, this woman who had lived with Mado and apparently found a way to endure, if not thrive. If she could do it, perhaps Ayana could as well. Perhaps there was a way to navigate this marriage that would preserve some core of herself, some private space where her true thoughts and feelings could survive. The sound of horses approaching at speed interrupted her thoughts. Through the lodge walls came the sound of urgent voices, men calling out in excitement rather than alarm. Ayana and her attendants froze, listening as the commotion grew closer. "Riders approaching from the east," someone shouted. "White men, but flying a flag of truce." The women looked at each other with expressions ranging from curiosity to concern. White settlers rarely came this deep into Apache territory, and when they did, it usually meant trouble of one kind or another. For them to arrive on the day of an important wedding ceremony seemed like either remarkable coincidence or very poor. Timing. Running Wolf moved to the lodge entrance and peered out through the hanging that covered the doorway. 3 riders, she reported. One carries what looks like a military flag, but they're dressed like civilians. They're requesting an audience with your father. Ayanna felt her heart begin to race for reasons she couldn't entirely explain. Something about this unexpected arrival felt significant, like a stone thrown into still water that would send ripples spreading in all directions. She found herself hoping, though she couldn't say for what exactly, that these strangers might somehow change the course of events that seemed so fixed and inevitable. Should I? She began, but Running Wolf shook her head firmly. No, child. This is not women's business, and certainly not bride's business. Your place is here, preparing for your ceremony. Let the men deal with whatever brings these white men to our village today. But even as she nodded obediently, Ayanna found her attention drawn to the sounds filtering in from outside, the steady approach of horses, the low voices of men in discussion, the sense that something unexpected was about to unfold. For the first time all day, she felt a flutter of something that might have been hope, though she dared not examine too closely what she hoped for. The wedding preparations continued around her, the women's hands steady and sure as they completed the transformation that would mark her passage from maiden to wife. But Ayanna's mind was elsewhere now, caught between the ceremony that awaited her and the unknown possibilities represented by these unexpected visitors. Outside, she could hear her father's voice raised in formal greeting, could hear Mehu's deeper tones joining the conversation. Whatever business had brought the white men here would be concluded quickly, she knew. Nothing would be allowed to interfere with the alliance ceremony that had been planned for so long and meant so much to both their people's survival. Yet as the final touches were applied to her ceremonial appearance, as the last ornaments were placed and the last prayers whispered over her preparation, Ayanna found herself listening not to the wedding songs beginning outside, but to the unfamiliar voices of the strangers whose arrival had disrupted the careful order of her wedding day. The transformation was complete. In the polished metal mirror, she saw not herself but the perfect image of an Apache bride, beautiful, serene, ready to fulfill her destiny as the bridge between two peoples. But behind the painted symbols and beneath the magnificent dress, her heart hammered with the rhythm of wild horses running free across an endless plain. The 3 white men who rode into the village, clearing dismounted with the careful movements of people who understood they were vastly outnumbered and completely at the mercy of their hosts. Their leader, a tall man with sun-weathered skin and prematurely gray hair, held the truce flag steady as he approached the circle where Chief Nalnish and Mato waited with their respective councils of warriors and elders. From her position inside the marriage lodge, Ayanna could hear fragments of the conversation that began to unfold in the village center. The white man's voice carried clearly in the desert air, speaking in heavily accented but comprehensible Apache, his words careful and respectful in a way that suggested previous experience dealing with her people. Honored Chief Nalnish, Stranger said, his voice carrying the weight of genuine urgency beneath its diplomatic tone. I am Captain Samuel Morrison, formerly of the United States Cavalry, now representing the territorial government in matters of delicate negotiation. I come seeking your wisdom in a matter that concerns both our peoples. Chief Nalnish's response was measured, cautious. Captain Morrison, your arrival on this day is unexpected. We are in the midst of sacred ceremonies. Perhaps another time would be more appropriate for whatever business brings you so far from your settlements. I understand, Chief, and I would not interrupt such important proceedings if the matter were not urgent. 3 days ago, a wagon train carrying families seeking new homesteads was attacked some 20 miles east of here. 7 people were killed, including 2 children. The survivors claim it was Apache raiders. No raiding parties have left this village, Chief Nalnish said firmly. We honor our agreements with the territorial government. We do not make war on families seeking only to pass through our lands. I believe you, Chief, Morrison replied. Quickly, but the evidence left at the scene. Arrows bearing northern band markings. War paint and patterns associated with your allied tribes. The cavalry is already mobilizing. The words hit the gathering like a physical blow. Ayanna could hear the immediate tension in the voices that responded, the anger and denial that rose from both her father's warriors and Mato's men. She pressed closer to the lodge entrance, straining to hear every word of this conversation that had so suddenly changed the atmosphere of her wedding day. No raiding parties have left this village, Chief Nalnish said firmly. We honor our agreements with the territorial government. We do not make war on families seeking only to pass through our lands. I believe you, Chief, Morrison replied. Quickly, but the evidence left at the scene. Arrows bearing northern band markings. War paint and patterns associated with your allied tribes. The cavalry is already mobilizing to respond, and there are those among them who care little for distinguishing between peaceful Apache and hostile ones. Mato's voice cut through the discussion like a blade. You accuse my warriors of breaking faith? Of making war on children? I accuse no one without proof, Morrison said carefully. But I've seen what happens when the army decides to retaliate against Apache raids. Entire villages burned, families scattered, innocents killed alongside the guilty. I've ridden here to see if there might be another explanation. Another way to resolve this before blood flows on both sides. Inside the lodge, Ayanna felt her heart sink as she began to understand the implications of this news. An alliance wedding during a time of rising tensions between whites and Apaches would now be seen not as a cause for celebration, but as evidence of hostile intent. The very ceremony meant to strengthen her people could be twisted into proof of their guilt. Running Wolf, who had been listening at the lodge entrance, turned back to the other women with a grave expression. This changes everything, she whispered. If the soldiers believe our people are responsible for this attack, they'll use the wedding as evidence that we're gathering warriors for war, Singing Bird finished grimly. A war chief taking a wife from a peaceful band. They'll say it proves we're all in alliance against the whites. The marriage preparations had come to a complete halt as the women strained to hear the ongoing discussion outside. Ayanna found herself caught between relief that the ceremony might be postponed and terror at what this development might mean for her people's safety. Morrison's voice continued, urgent and persuasive. Chief Nalnish, I've dealt with your people before. I know you to be a man of honor, a leader who seeks peace when possible. But there are forces in motion now that neither of us may be able to control. Colonel Harrison is 3 days behind me with a full company of cavalry. When he arrives, he'll be looking for someone to blame, someone to punish. If he finds a village celebrating an alliance between bands, what do you propose? Chief Nalnish asked, and Ayanna could hear the weight of leadership in his voice. The careful calculation of a man trying to protect his people while navigating an impossible situation. Help me find the real raiders, Morrison said. If we can prove your innocence, demonstrate that other forces are responsible for the attack, it might be enough to turn the army's attention elsewhere. But I need your cooperation, your scouts, your knowledge of the territory, and in return, I do everything in my power to keep Colonel Harrison from treating this village as hostile territory. I can't promise complete safety. The man is ambitious and sees Apache campaigns as his path to promotion. But I can promise to bear witness to your cooperation, to testify that you aided rather than hindered the investigation. The discussion continued, but Ayanna's attention was drawn by new sounds, the approach of a single horse, ridden at a moderate pace by someone trying not to appear threatening. Through a gap in the lodge wall, she caught a glimpse of the third member of Morrison's party, who had remained mounted and somewhat apart from the main group during the Fey Wadu negotiations. What she saw made her catch her breath in surprise. The rider was young, perhaps only a few years older than herself, with dark hair and thoughtful eyes that seemed to take in everything around him with careful attention. Unlike Morrison, who bore himself with military bearing despite his civilian clothes, this man had the relaxed posture of someone comfortable in wild places, at ease with uncertainty and danger. He was leading a pack horse loaded with supplies, and as Ayanna watched, he dismounted and began the process of setting up what appeared to be a small camp at a respectful distance from the village proper. His movements were efficient but unhurried, suggesting a man accustomed to making himself comfortable in unfamiliar territory, while remaining ready to move quickly if circumstances required it. There was something about his careful respect for the village's boundaries, his obvious effort to appear non-threatening while remaining alert, that sparked Ayanna's curiosity. Most white men she had encountered either swaggered with false bravado or cowered with obvious fear. This one seemed simply present, aware, respectful of the situation he found himself in. "Who is the young man?" she asked Running Wolf quietly. The older woman peered through the gap in the lodge wall. "I don't know, child. Perhaps Morrison's scout or a translator. Why do you ask?" Ayanna couldn't have explained why the stranger's presence interested her. Perhaps it was simply that anything unexpected on this day of dreaded certainties seemed worth attention. Or perhaps it was something in his manner, the way he moved with confidence but without arrogance, that suggested a different kind of person than she had expected. Outside, the main discussion was reaching some kind of conclusion. Chief Nalnish and Matu were conferring in low voices while Morrison waited patiently, his weathered face showing the strain of a man trying to prevent a catastrophe through words alone. "We will send scouts to investigate these claims, Chief," Nalnish announced finally. "If raiders bearing our markings are responsible for these deaths, we will find them and deliver justice according to our laws. But the ceremony will proceed as planned. We will not allow fear of false accusations to disrupt the bonds being forged between our peoples." Morrison nodded, though his expression remained troubled. "I understand, Chief, and I respect your determination to honor your commitments. But I must warn you, when Colonel Harrison arrives and finds a war chief newly married to the daughter of a peaceful band, he'll see confirmation of his worst suspicions about Apache unity against white settlement." "Then perhaps," Mata said, with quiet intensity, "it is time for the whites to understand that Apache unity need not mean Apache hostility. We gather not for war, but for strength, not to attack, but to survive." As the formal discussions concluded and the various groups began to disperse, Ayanna found herself still watching the young stranger who had been setting up camp. He had finished his preparations and now sat by a small fire, apparently content to wait for whatever would happen next. There was something almost meditative about his stillness, as if he were listening not just to the sounds of the village but to something deeper, the rhythm of the land itself, perhaps, or the subtle currents of tension and possibility that flowed beneath the surface of events. Running Wolf noticed the direction of her gaze and frowned. "Ayanna, child, your wedding ceremony begins within the hour. These strangers and their troubles are not your concern, aren't they?" Ayanna asked quietly. "If what Morrison says is true, if soldiers are coming who will see our wedding as proof of hostile intent, then aren't these troubles already ours?" The older woman's expression softened slightly. "Perhaps, but that is for the men to decide, for the chiefs to handle. Your duty remains unchanged." Duty. The word fell between them like a stone, heavy with all the weight it had carried throughout Ayanna's life. Duty to her father, to her people, to the alliance that would keep them safe. Duty to accept what could not be changed, to find strength in submission, to become what others needed her to be, rather than what she might choose to become. But as she prepared to turn away from the lodge wall and submit to the final preparations for her ceremony, Ayanna found herself looking once more at the stranger by his quiet fire. Something in his manner, the patient alertness, the respectful distance, the suggestion of someone accustomed to watching and thinking rather than simply acting, called to something in her own nature that had been suppressed but never destroyed. For just a moment, she allowed herself to imagine what it might be like to sit by such a fire, to be free to watch the sunset without the weight of predetermined fate pressing down upon her shoulders. She imagined what it might be like to choose her own path, to discover what kind of person she might become if she were not bound by the expectations of others. The fantasy lasted only seconds before reality reasserted itself. In less than an hour, she would stand before the assembled tribes and speak the words that would bind her to Mato, would seal the alliance that might keep her people alive in the dangerous times ahead. The ceremony would proceed regardless of Morrison's warnings, regardless of approaching soldiers, regardless of any dreams she might harbor about freedom and choice. Yet something had changed in those few moments of observation. Some small crack had appeared in the wall of resignation she had built around her heart. She could not have said what that change might lead to, could not even be sure that it meant anything at all. But for the first time since learning of her fate, Ayanna felt something stir within her that was not despair or duty, but possibility. The sun was approaching its zenith, the time appointed for the ceremony drawing near. Soon the drums would call her from the marriage lodge, and she would walk toward her future with measured steps and painted face, the perfect image of a chief's daughter accepting her destiny. But until that moment came, she allowed herself to wonder about the quiet stranger whose presence had somehow reminded her that there were other ways to be in the world than the one that had been chosen for her. Outside, the village prepared for a wedding that would now take place under the shadow of approaching conflict. Inside the lodge, a young woman prepared to surrender her freedom, while a new and fragile hope took root in the hidden corners of her heart. The wedding drums began their ancient rhythm as the sun reached its peak, their deep voices echoing off the canyon walls like the heartbeat of the earth itself. Ayanna closed her eyes and let the sound wash over her, trying to find in that primal music some connection to the generations of women who had walked this path before her, who had found ways to survive and even thrive within the constraints of tradition and necessity. Running, Wolf and the other elder women made their final adjustments to Ayanna's ceremonial appearance, their weathered hands gentle but sure as they positioned the silver ornaments that caught and reflected the harsh midday light. The wedding dress, a masterpiece of their people's artistry, transformed her into something that seemed more symbol than person, the perfect representation of a chief's daughter, fulfilling her destiny. "It is time, child," Running Wolf whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Remember what your grandmother used to say about bend and break. Remember that survival takes many forms." Ayanna nodded, not trusting herself to speak. Through the lodge walls, she could hear the assembled crowd gathering in the ceremonial circle, could smell the smoke from the sacred fires that had been lit to honor the spirits and call their blessing upon the union about to take place. Everything proceeded exactly as it had been planned, as if Morrison's dire warnings about approaching cavalry and false accusations had never been spoken. The lodge flap opened, and Chief Nalnish appeared in the entrance, magnificent in his ceremonial robes and feathered headdress. For a moment, father and daughter simply looked at each other across the small space, both understanding that this moment marked an ending as much as a beginning. When she took his offered arm and stepped out into the brilliant sunlight, Ayanna would cease to be simply his daughter and become something else entirely. "Are you ready, my child?" he asked quietly, his voice carrying depths of love and regret that made her throat tighten with unshed tears. "Yes, father," she replied, though the words felt like stones in her mouth. "I am ready." Together, they emerged from the marriage lodge into a scene that took Ayanna's breath away, despite her familiarity with her people's ceremonies. The entire village had gathered in concentric circles around the sacred fire, their faces painted with ceremonial designs, their finest clothing glittering with beads and silver in the afternoon light. Mato's warriors had integrated themselves among her father's people, creating a visual representation of the alliance this marriage was meant to seal. At the center of it all stood Mato himself, resplendent in war paint and ceremonial dress that spoke of his status as a leader among his people. Eagle feathers adorned his hair, and his chest bore the painted symbols of his clan and his victories. He looked every inch the war chief he was, powerful, dangerous, utterly self-assured. When his eyes found Ayanna across the ceremonial space, she saw in them the same calculating assessment she had noticed before, as if he were evaluating her worthiness to bear his children and maintain his household. The drums continued their relentless rhythm as Ayanna and her father began the slow procession toward the marriage altar. Each step felt weighted with significance, carrying her inexorably toward a future she could not escape. The watching crowd pressed close on either side, their faces a mixture of celebration and solemnity, understanding that they were witnessing not just a wedding but the forging of bonds that might determine their people's survival in the turbulent years ahead. As they walked, Ayanna's gaze was drawn involuntarily to the edge of the gathering, where Morrison and his two companions stood. At a respectful distance, the captain himself watched the proceedings with obvious tension, his weathered face showing the strain of a man who knew that everything unfolding before him would be reported to Colonel Harrison as evidence of Apache conspiracy. His presence cast a shadow over the celebration, a reminder that this joyous occasion might soon be used to justify violence against her people. But it was Morrison's younger companion who held Ayanna's attention. Unlike the captain, who watched with military alertness and growing concern, the stranger observed the ceremony with what appeared to be genuine interest and respect. His eyes moved over the assembled crowd, taking in the intricate beadwork, the ceremonial paintings, the careful choreography of the ritual, as if he were trying to understand not just what was happening, but what it meant to the people participating in it. When their eyes met across the ceremonial space, Ayanna felt something pass between them that she could not name. It was not the bold appraisal she was accustomed to from young warriors, nor the calculating assessment she had seen in Mato's gaze. Instead, there was something almost like recognition in his eyes, as if he saw her not as a symbol or prize, but as a person trapped in circumstances beyond her control. The moment lasted only seconds before Ayanna forced herself to look away, focusing on the path ahead and the man waiting to claim her at its end. But something about that brief connection stayed with her, a spark of warmth in the cold certainty of her fate. The procession reached the sacred fire, where the tribal elders waited with the ancient words and rituals that would bind her to Mato for life. The ceremony that followed unfolded with the timeless dignity of tradition, each element carrying the weight of generations who had spoken these same vows, made these same promises, submitted to these same bonds of duty and alliance. Mato stepped forward to receive her from her father's hands. The exchange symbolic of property transferred, protection passed from one man to another. His grip on her arm was firm, but not cruel, possessive without being brutal. When he spoke the ritual words accepting her as his wife, his voice carried the authority of a man accustomed to having his commands obeyed without question. Ayanna's own responses came automatically, the phrases she had practiced until they required number thought, no conscious participation from the woman speaking them. She promised to honor her husband, to bear his children, to support his decisions, and submit to his authority in all things. The words fell from her lips like drops of water, each one carrying away a piece of the person she had been until only the shell of a dutiful wife remained. The tribal shaman stepped forward with the sacred cord that would bind their wrists together, the physical representation of the spiritual and legal bonds being forged. As the rough hemp tightened around her skin, Ayanna felt something inside her break, some last vestige of hope or rebellion finally surrendering to the inevitable. But even as she submitted to the binding, her eyes found the stranger again, and this time she saw something that made her heart skip. He was no longer simply watching the ceremony with respectful interest. Instead, his attention was focused intently on Morrison, who was speaking to him in urgent whispers, while keeping his voice too low to be overheard by the celebrating crowd. Whatever Morrison was saying caused a visible change in the younger man's posture. His easy relaxation transformed into sharp alertness, and his gaze began moving systematically around the edges of the gathering, as if looking for something or someone that shouldn't be there. His hand moved casually, but deliberately to rest near the grip of the pistol at his hip, a gesture that spoke of readiness without display. The realization hit Ayanna like a physical blow. Morrison's warnings about approaching cavalry had not been theoretical. The soldiers were closer than anyone had realized, close enough that trained eyes could spot their approach, close enough that this ceremony of alliance was about to become evidence of Apache hostility in the eyes of men who had already decided what they would find. As if summoned by her sudden understanding, the sound of distant horses reached the gathered crowd. At first, only a few people noticed, their heads turning toward the canyon entrance with expressions of mild curiosity. But as the sound grew closer and more distinct, the celebration began to falter. The drums continued their rhythm, but conversations died away as more and more people became aware that something was approaching the village. Mato's grip on Ayanna's bound wrist tightened, his warrior instincts alert to the change in atmosphere even as he continued to speak the ritual words. Chief Nalnish stepped closer to the married couple, his eyes fixed on the canyon mouth where dust was beginning to rise in a telltale cloud that spoke of many horses moving fast. Morrison moved quickly through the crowd, his military bearing now openly displayed as he approached the ceremonial fire. "Chief Nalnish," he called out, his voice cutting through the drums and chanting. "With respect, we need to speak immediately. The colonel has arrived ahead of schedule." The words sent a ripple of tension through the assembled crowd. Warriors who had been celebrating began to shift positions, their hands moving instinctively toward weapons, while their eyes sought the best defensive positions around the village. Women gathered their children closer, while the elders exchanged glances that spoke of hard-earned wisdom about what it meant when soldiers arrived uninvited at Apache celebrations. "How many?" Chief Nalnish asked, his voice carrying the calm authority of a leader who had faced such crises before. "A full company," Morrison replied grimly. "Maybe 40 men, well-armed and expecting trouble." Colonel Harrison is not known for his diplomatic approach to Indian affairs. Mato released Ayanna's wrist and stepped forward, his transformation from bridegroom to war chief instantaneous and complete. "Do they come for battle or parley?" "That may depend," Morrison said carefully, "on what they find when they arrive." A wedding ceremony between allied bands, warriors gathered from across the territory. It won't look peaceful to men who've already decided you're guilty of raiding wagon trains. The sound of approaching horses was now unmistakable, accompanied by the jingle of cavalry equipment and the rhythmic thunder of military formation. Chief Nalnish looked around the ceremonial gathering, taking in the painted warriors, the celebration decorations, the obvious signs of alliance between the bands. Everything that was meant to demonstrate unity and strength would be seen as proof of conspiracy and hostile intent. "Disperse the celebration," he ordered quietly. "Warriors, remove war paint and ceremonial weapons. Women and children, return to your lodges. Move quickly but without panic. We meet these soldiers as a peaceful village going about normal daily business." As the crowd began to dissolve with remarkable efficiency, Ayanna found herself standing in the rapidly emptying ceremonial space, still bound to Mato by the cord around their wrists, still wearing the elaborate wedding dress that proclaimed her new status to anyone who cared to look. The ceremony had been completed in the legal sense. They were married according to Apache law and tradition. But the celebration that should have followed The feast and dancing that would have marked the beginning of their new life together was being swept away by the approach of men who would see only threat in Apache. Joy, Morrison's young companion, appeared at Ayana's side, moving with a quiet urgency that suggested both respect and determination. "Ma'am," he said softly, his voice carrying an accent she couldn't place but found strangely comforting. "My name is Thomas Brennan. I think we need to talk." Before either Ayana or Mata could respond, the first of the cavalry appeared at the canyon entrance, their blue uniforms stark against the red rock walls, their weapons gleaming in the afternoon sun. At their head rode a man whose bearing proclaimed his authority, even at a distance, Colonel Harrison, the ambitious officer whose hunger for Apache campaigns Morrison had warned them about. The wedding was over, the celebration destroyed, the alliance sealed but immediately threatened by forces beyond any of their control. As the soldiers spread out across the canyon entrance in a display of overwhelming force, Ayana realized that her moment of choosing had arrived far sooner than anyone could have anticipated. Colonel Harrison rode into the village clearing with the bearing of a man who had already decided what he would find and how he would respond to it. His uniform was immaculate despite the long ride, his brass buttons catching the afternoon sunlight like small suns, his saber hanging at his side. With the casual authority of someone accustomed to having his word backed by force. Behind him, 40 mounted soldiers arranged themselves in a loose semicircle that managed to appear both protective and threatening, their carbines held ready but not quite aimed. The transformation of the village from wedding celebration to tense standoff had happened with remarkable speed, but not quickly enough to erase all evidence of what had been taking place. Scattered flower petals still dotted the ceremonial ground, and the lingering smoke from the sacred fires carried the sweet scent of the herbs that had been burned to bless the union. Most damning of all, Ayana still stood in the center of the clearing in her elaborate wedding dress, the ceremonial cord still binding her wrist to Mato's, creating an image that spoke more loudly than any words about Apache alliances and gathering strength. "Chief Nalnish," Harrison called out, his voice carrying the clipped authority of military command. "I am Colonel William Harrison of the 7th Cavalry. I understand you've been expecting us." The reference to Morrison's earlier warning was not lost on anyone present. Chief Nalnish stepped forward, his own bearing dignified and calm despite the obvious threat posed by the surrounding soldiers. "Colonel Harrison, you arrived during a time of celebration. My daughter has just been married to War Chief Matu of the Northern Band. Perhaps you would honor us by sharing in our joy." Harrison's laugh was short and humorless. "Celebration? Is that what we're calling it now when Apache bands gather warriors and seal military alliances?" His pale eyes swept across the assembled villagers, taking in the hastily concealed weapons. The war paint that hadn't been completely removed, the obvious signs of coordination between the two bands. "Captain Morrison tells me you've agreed to help investigate the attack on the Hendricks wagon train. I find it interesting that your investigation begins with a wedding that brings together fighters from across the territory." "The marriage of my daughter strengthens bonds of peace," Chief Nalnish replied carefully. "It creates family ties that discourage conflict between our peoples. Surely this serves the interest of stability that your government claims to value." "Stability?" Harrison dismounted, his movements deliberate and threatening. 7 white settlers are dead, Colonel. 2 of them are children. The evidence points to Apache raiders using Northern Band arrows and war paint. And I ride into your village to find exactly what that evidence suggested. Northern and Southern bands united, warriors gathered, alliances sealed. He gestured toward Ayana and Mato, still bound together by the ceremonial cord. "This isn't a wedding, Chief. This is a war council disguised as a celebration." Ayana felt the weight of Harrison's accusation settling over the gathering like a heavy blanket. Everything about the day's events, seen through the lens of suspicion and fear, could indeed be interpreted as evidence of hostile intent. The timing of the wedding, the gathering of warriors, the obvious coordination between bands, it all supported a narrative of Apache conspiracy that she could see taking shape in the colonel's mind. Thomas Brennan had moved closer during the exchange, positioning himself where he could observe both the military confrontation and Ayana's reactions. When she glanced toward him, seeking some anchor of sanity in the increasingly surreal situation, she found him watching her with an intensity that was both comforting and unsettling. There was something in his eyes that suggested he understood exactly what was happening to her, exactly what choice she was facing. "Colonel," Morrison interjected, stepping forward with the careful diplomacy of a man trying to prevent bloodshed. "Perhaps we could discuss this situation more privately. The chief has agreed to provide scouts to help track the real raiders. Surely that cooperation suggests peaceful rather than hostile intent." Harrison turned his cold gaze on Morrison, and Ayana could see the tension between the two men, the fundamental disagreement about how to handle Apache relations. "Captain Morrison, your faith in Apache cooperation is noted. But I prefer evidence to promises, action to words." He turned back to Chief Nalnish. "You want to prove your peaceful intentions? You want to demonstrate that this gathering isn't preparation for war? Then you'll submit to military supervision while we conduct our investigation. What exactly are you proposing?" Chief Nalnish asked, though his tone suggested he already suspected he wouldn't like the answer. "House arrest for all war chiefs and village leaders until this matter is resolved. Confiscation of weapons to prevent any unfortunate incidents. Military oversight of all tribal activities until we're satisfied that no further raids are being planned." Harrison's smile was sharp as a blade. Standard procedure when dealing with potentially hostile Indian populations. The words hit the gathering like physical blows. Ayana could see the anger rippling through both bands of warriors, could feel the tension ratcheting upward as proud men contemplated submission to such humiliating treatment. Mato's hand moved instinctively toward his weapon before he caught himself, the gesture so subtle that only those closest to him would have noticed. But Harrison noticed, and his own hand dropped to rest on his saber hilt. "I see," the colonel said softly. "The Apache response to a reasonable request for cooperation. Perhaps Captain Morrison was wrong about your peaceful intentions." Ayana felt the moment balanced on a knife's edge, poised between reluctant submission and explosive violence. Everything depended on how her father chose to respond, on whether he could swallow his pride long enough to prevent the bloodbath that Harrison seemed almost eager to provoke. But she could see in his face the struggle between leadership and dignity, between survival and honor. That was when Thomas Brennan stepped forward, his movement casual but purposeful. "Colonel Harrison," he said, his voice carrying an authority that seemed to surprise everyone present, including Morrison. "Perhaps there's another way to handle this situation." Harrison turned toward the younger man, his expression mixing irritation with curiosity. "Mr. Brennan, isn't it? Captain Morrison mentioned you were some kind of specialist, though he was vague about your particular expertise. I'm a translator, sir. Languages and customs. I've spent considerable time among various tribal groups, learning their ways, studying their cultures." Brennan's voice was respectful but firm, carrying an undertone of knowledge that demanded attention. "What you're seeing here isn't preparation for war, Colonel. It's exactly what Chief Nalnish said, a traditional alliance marriage meant to prevent conflict between rival bands. And you base this assessment on what, exactly?" Harrison's tone was skeptical, but he seemed genuinely curious about Brennan's perspective. "On the ceremony itself, sir. If this were a war council, the rituals would be completely different. The placement of warriors, the ceremonial elements, the timing, everything about today's events follows the patterns of a peaceful alliance wedding, not a military gathering." Brennan gestured toward the scattered remains of the celebration. More importantly, sir, if the Apache were planning raids against white settlements, they wouldn't hold their war councils in the open where they could be observed. They certainly wouldn't invite white witnesses to watch their preparations. Ayanna found herself holding her breath as she listened to Brennan's calm, reasoned explanation. Here was someone who actually understood her people's customs, who could see past the surface appearance of warrior gatherings and ceremonial weapons to recognize the peaceful intent behind the day's events. For the first time since the soldiers had arrived, she felt a flicker of hope that this confrontation might be resolved without bloodshed. Harrison considered Brennan's words, his expression thoughtful. An interesting perspective, Mr. Brennan, but it doesn't change the fact that 7 settlers are dead, and the evidence points to Apache involvement. Even if today's ceremony was peaceful in intent, it creates exactly the kind of intertribal alliance that could threaten white settlements. Which is why, Brennan said carefully, it might be more useful to accept Chief Nalnish's offer of assistance, rather than treating him as a suspect. If Apache raiders are responsible for the attack, no one has more incentive to find them than legitimate Apache leaders who know that all their people will be blamed for the actions of a few. The debate continued, but Ayanna found her attention increasingly focused on Brennan himself rather than his words. There was something about his manner, his obvious knowledge of her people's ways, his willingness to speak up in their defense, that set him apart from other white men she had encountered. Most whites saw Apaches as a single, undifferentiated threat. Brennan seemed to understand that they were individuals, families, communities with their own internal politics and conflicts. More than that, when he looked at her, she saw something she hadn't expected. Not desire or calculation or assessment of her worth as a symbol, but simple recognition of her humanity. In his eyes, she was not the Apache chief's daughter or the war chief's new wife, but simply a person caught in circumstances beyond her control. The recognition was both comforting and dangerous, offering a glimpse of what it might be like to be seen as herself rather than as the roles others had assigned to her. Mato had been silent throughout the confrontation, but now he stepped forward, his presence immediately commanding attention. "Colonel Harrison," he said, his voice carrying the controlled power of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "I am Matu of the Northern Band. The woman you see here is now my wife according to the laws of our people. Any accusations you make against Apache raiders reflect on my honor and the honor of my warriors." "Then perhaps," Harrison replied coldly, "your honor requires that you help us find these raiders, rather than protect them behind claims of tribal solidarity. My honor requires that I protect my people from false accusations and unjust punishment." Mato shot back. "But if evidence exists that any of my warriors have broken faith with the agreements we've made, I will deliver justice myself according to Apache law." The two men faced each other across the ceremonial ground, representatives of two different worlds that seemed increasingly unable to coexist. Harrison saw savage cunning behind every Apache gesture, while Mato saw white treachery in every demand for submission. Neither man was entirely wrong, but neither was entirely right either, and the gulf between their perspectives seemed impossible to bridge. It was in that moment of impasse that Ayanna made a decision that would change everything. Still bound to Mato by the ceremonial cord, still dressed in the elaborate wedding regalia that proclaimed her new status, she stepped forward into the space between the two groups. "Colonel Harrison," she said, her voice clear and steady despite the magnitude of what she was about to do. "I am Ayanna, daughter of Chief Nalnish, wife of War Chief Mato. I speak for myself and for the truth that seems lost in the anger between our peoples." The boldness of her action sent shock waves through both groups. Apache women, particularly newly married ones, did not speak in council meetings between men. They certainly did not insert themselves into military confrontations with white soldiers. But Ayanna had moved beyond the constraints of custom, driven by a desperate need to prevent the violence she could feel building around them. The attack on the wagon train, she continued, ignoring the scandalized expressions of the Apache elders and the surprised looks of the soldiers. If it was done by Apache raiders, it was not done with the knowledge or approval of either of these bands. My father's people have honored their agreements with your government. My husband's warriors have focused their attention on traditional enemies to the north and east, not on white settlements. Harrison stared at her as if she were some exotic creature he had never encountered before. You speak English remarkably well for someone raised in such isolation. I speak English because understanding between our peoples requires communication, Ayanna replied. I speak now because I see that communication is failing, replaced by suspicion and threats that will lead only to bloodshed and suffering. Brennan moved closer, his expression intense with what looked like admiration mixed with concern. She's right, Colonel. If we're going to solve this problem, we need to work together rather than treat each other as enemies. A touching sentiment, Harrison said dryly. But sentiment won't bring back the dead settlers or prevent future attacks. I need concrete action, not pretty speeches about cooperation. Ayanna felt the moment slipping away, felt the careful balance she had tried to create crumbling under the weight of Harrison's skepticism and the growing anger of the warriors around her. In desperation, she played the only card she had left. Then, "Take me," she said quietly. The words fell into sudden silence as everyone tried to process what she had just said. Even the horses seemed to still, as if sensing the importance of the moment. "Take you?" Harrison repeated, his voice carefully neutral. "As surety for my people's good faith," Ayanna continued, her heart hammering so hard she was sure everyone could hear it. "As guarantee that the investigation will be conducted fairly and that no raids will be launched while it continues. Hold me as hostage until the real attackers are found and brought to justice." The suggestion caused an immediate uproar. Matu jerked against the cord binding them together, his face dark with fury at the suggestion that his new wife would place herself in white hands. Chief Nalmish stepped forward, his expression thunderous, while the assembled warriors muttered angrily among themselves. "Ayanna," her father said, his voice tight with controlled emotion, "you forget yourself. You forget your place and your duties." "No, father," she replied, turning to face him with tears streaming down her painted cheeks. "I remember exactly what my duties are. To my people, to peace, to preventing the war that will destroy us all if we cannot find another way." Brennan was staring at her with an expression she couldn't quite read, something between admiration and anguish. "Ma'am," he said softly, "you don't understand what you're suggesting. Military custody. It's not safe for someone like you." "Someone like me?" Ayanna asked, meeting his eyes directly for the first time. "Someone brave enough to risk everything for what's right," he replied, and the simple honesty in his voice nearly broke her resolve. Harrison looked around the gathering, taking in the shocked faces of the Apaches and the uncertain expressions of his own men. "An interesting proposal," he said finally, "but problematic. Military regulations don't really cover this sort of arrangement." "Then don't make it military," Brennan said suddenly, his voice carrying a new urgency. "Make it civilian. I'm authorized to act as liaison with tribal populations for the territorial government. I could accept responsibility for Miss Ayanna's safety and well-being during the investigation." The suggestion hit Ayanna like a physical shock. Here was the choice she hadn't dared to hope for, the possibility of escape from the life that had been chosen for her. Not escape into emptiness or abandonment, but into the care of someone who had shown her more understanding in a few hours than Mato had in all their previous encounters. But even as hope flared in her chest, she felt the weight of everything she would be abandoning: her people, her family, her place in the only world she had ever known. The cord around her wrist seemed to tighten, reminding her of the vow she had just spoken, the obligations she had just accepted. "This is madness," Mato said, his voice low and dangerous. "My wife does not place herself under the protection of white men. She does not abandon her people for the sake of strangers who would see us all destroyed." "Then stop her," Harrison said with cold amusement. "You're her husband, are you not? Exercise your authority." Mato's hand moved to the knife at his belt, and for a moment Ayanna thought he might cut the ceremonial cord that bound them together. But that would mean publicly. Rejecting the marriage that had just been celebrated would mean destroying the alliance that had been purchased with her freedom. The politics that had created their union also trapped him within it. "The choice," Ayanna said quietly, her voice somehow carrying to every person in the clearing, "must be mine." She looked around the circle of faces, her father's anguished love, Mato's frustrated anger, Harrison's calculating interest, Morrison's concerned confusion. Finally, her gaze settled on Thomas Brennan, this stranger who had offered her something she had never expected, the chance to choose her own path. "If I do this," she asked indirectly, "if I place myself under your protection, what becomes of me when the investigation is finished?" Brennan's answer came without hesitation, his voice ringing with conviction. "Whatever you choose to become, whatever path you decide is yours to walk. The choice will be yours, and yours alone." For the first time in her life, Ayanna heard someone offer her genuine freedom. Not the illusion of choice between predetermined options, but the terrifying and exhilarating possibility of writing her own story. The offer was as frightening as it was appealing, requiring her to abandon everything familiar for a future she couldn't even imagine. But as she stood there in her wedding dress, bound by ceremony to a man who saw her as property, surrounded by the politics and pressures that had shaped her entire life, Ayanna realized that some choices were worth any risk. She reached for the knife at her belt, the small blade that every Apache woman carried for cutting leather and preparing food. With one swift motion, she severed the ceremonial cord that bound her to Mato, the hemp fibers parting with a soft whisper that seemed to echo like thunder in the sudden silence. "I choose," she said, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was doing, "to be free." 3 months had passed since Ayanna severed the ceremonial cord that bound her to a life she never chose. 3 months since she walked away from everything familiar and stepped into a world where her choices belonged to her alone. The investigation into the wagon train attack had concluded weeks ago with the capture of a rogue band of Apache raiders, who had been operating without tribal sanction, led by a bitter war chief named Scarface, who had refused to accept any peace with white settlers. The truth, when it finally emerged, vindicated both Chief Nalnish and Matu completely. The raiders had deliberately used northern band arrows and war paint to implicate peaceful tribes, hoping to provoke military retaliation that would force all Apache bands back into open warfare. Colonel Harrison, faced with irrefutable evidence of the real perpetrators and the peaceful tribe's cooperation in tracking them down, had been forced to issue a formal apology and withdraw his accusations. But for Ayanna, the resolution of the political crisis had been less important than the personal transformation that had begun the moment she chose freedom over duty. Thomas Brennan had kept his word in ways that went far beyond simple protection during the investigation. He had offered her something she had never experienced before: genuine partnership, respect for her intelligence and capabilities, and the space to discover who she might become when freed from others' expectations. Now, as autumn painted the cottonwoods along the Rio Grande in shades of gold and crimson, Ayanna stood on the porch of the small ranch house that had become her home, watching Thomas work with the horses in the corral below. The sight never failed to move her. This man who had risked his career and reputation to offer her freedom, who had spent the past months teaching her to read and write English while learning Apache customs and language from her, who had courted her with a patience and gentleness that made her previous life seem like a half-remembered dream. The ranch itself was modest but beautiful, nestled in a valley between red mesas where Thomas had filed a homestead claim using money he had saved from years of government translation work. It was far enough from the military posts and Indian agencies to offer privacy, but close enough to the territorial capital that Thomas could continue his work as a cultural liaison when his services were needed. More importantly, it was a place where an Apache woman and a white man could build a life together without constant scrutiny or judgment. Their relationship had developed slowly, carefully, built on mutual respect and genuine affection rather than the political necessity that had characterized her brief marriage to Matu. Thomas had never presumed that her gratitude for rescue meant romantic attachment, had never pressured her to become anything other than what she chose to be. Instead, he had simply been present, patient, kind, intellectually curious, eager to learn from her, just as she learned from him. The sound of approaching riders drew Ayana's attention to the mesa trail that led to their valley. 2 figures were making their way down the steep path, and even at a distance she could recognize the easy posture of one rider and the more formal bearing of the other. Captain Morrison, who had become a regular visitor and friend, was arriving with someone Ayana didn't immediately recognize. Thomas had noticed the riders too, and was already walking up from the corral, his face showing the alert but relaxed expression of a man who had learned to be cautious without living in constant fear. The past months had brought occasional visits from both Apache friends and white officials, most of them friendly but all requiring careful navigation of the complex social and political landscape they inhabited. Expecting company? Thomas asked, as he joined Ayana on the porch, his hand finding hers with the easy familiarity of lovers who had learned to trust completely in each other's presence. Morrison said he might bring the new territorial governor by sometime this month. Ayana replied, studying the approaching figures, though I can't tell if that's who's with him. As the riders drew closer, the identity of Morrison's companion became clear. Governor Samuel Crawford was a tall, scholarly-looking man in his 50s, whose reputation for fairness and intelligence had preceded his appointment to the territorial post. Unlike many territorial officials who viewed Indians as obstacles to progress, Crawford was known for his belief that peaceful coexistence was both possible and necessary for the region's long-term stability. Morrison and Crawford dismounted. Near the porch, both men removing their hats in a gesture of respect that Ayana had learned to appreciate. The captain's weathered face showed genuine pleasure at seeing them again, while the governor's expression revealed curiosity mixed with the careful diplomacy of a politician meeting constituents whose support might prove valuable. Thomas, Ayana, Morrison said warmly, I'd like you to meet Governor Crawford. Governor, this is Thomas Brennan, the translator I've mentioned in my reports, and Ayana, formerly of Chief Naunish's band. Crawford stepped forward with the confident bearing of a man accustomed to making good first impressions. Mr. Brennan, miss. I'm sorry, how should I properly address you? Ayana will do fine, Governor, she replied in English that had improved dramatically over the past months, thanks to Thomas's patient instruction and her own voracious appetite for learning. We're honored by your visit. The honor is mine, Crawford said, and his tone suggested genuine sincerity rather than mere politeness. Captain Morrison has spoken very highly of both of you, particularly regarding your roles in resolving the difficulties we had this past summer. I understand that your cooperation was instrumental in identifying the real perpetrators of the wagon train attack. Thomas gestured toward the porch chairs they had built from pine logs, cut on their own land. Please sit. Ayana was just about to start dinner preparations, but we have time to talk. As they settled into the comfortable informality of the porch setting, Ayana found herself studying Governor Crawford's face for signs of the prejudice or condescension she had learned to expect from white officials. Instead, she saw genuine interest and what appeared to be respect for both her intelligence and her unique position as someone who understood both Apache and white perspectives. Actually, Crawford said once they were seated, I came here hoping to discuss a proposition with both of you. The territorial government is facing some significant challenges in our relations with the various Apache bands, and I believe you might be uniquely qualified to help us address them." Morrison leaned forward in his chair, his expression suggesting. This was not the first time he and the governor had discussed this topic. What the governor is proposing is something entirely new in territorial Indian policy. Instead of relying solely on military force or traditional treaty negotiations, he wants to establish a permanent cultural liaison office. The idea, Crawford continued, is to have people who truly understand both cultures working to prevent the kind of misunderstandings that led to this summer's crisis. Too often, conflicts arise not from genuine hostility, but from simple failures of communication and comprehension. Ayanna felt her pulse quicken as she began to understand what the governor was suggesting. "You're talking about creating official positions for people like us? People who can bridge the gap between Apache and white communities?" "Exactly," Crawford replied, his enthusiasm evident. "Thomas already has experience in this kind of work, obviously. And your own background, your ability to speak for Apache perspectives while understanding white concerns, makes you invaluable. Together, you could help prevent the kind of tragedies that have marked our recent history." Thomas was quiet for a long moment, clearly thinking through the implications of what was being offered. What exactly would this involve? What kind of authority would we have? What resources would be available? "Considerable authority," Crawford said. "You would report directly to my office, bypassing the military chain of command that has caused so many problems in the past. You would have the power to negotiate agreements, resolve disputes, and most importantly, educate both sides about each other's customs and concerns." The conversation continued for the better part of an hour, covering practical details about salary, living arrangements, travel requirements, and the delicate politics of establishing such an unprecedented position in territorial government. Throughout the discussion, Ayanna found herself increasingly excited by the possibilities being presented. Here was a chance to use her unique background and hard-won freedom for something larger than personal happiness. She could help prevent other young women from facing the kinds of impossible choices she had confronted, could work to build understanding between peoples who had been locked in cycles of mistrust and violence for generations. More than that, the position would allow her and Thomas to formalize their partnership not just personally, but professionally. They had discovered over the past months that they worked exceptionally well together, their different backgrounds and skills complementing each other in ways that made them more effective than either could be alone. "There's one concern I need to raise," Crawford said as the formal discussion began to wind down. "Your relationship, while admirable, puts both of you in a somewhat unusual position socially. There will be people on both sides who question your objectivity, who wonder if your personal feelings might interfere with your professional judgment." Ayanna exchanged a glance with Thomas, seeing her own thoughts reflected in his eyes. They had both known that their relationship would face scrutiny and criticism from people who saw interracial romance as either betrayal or contamination. But they had also learned that their love had made them stronger, more understanding, more capable of seeing beyond the prejudices that divided their peoples. "Governor," Thomas said carefully, "I won't pretend that our relationship doesn't complicate things politically, but I would argue that it also gives us insights that no one else could provide. We've had to navigate the challenges of bringing two cultures together in the most intimate possible way. That experience has taught us things about communication, compromise, and mutual respect that we couldn't have learned any other way." "Well said," Crawford replied with a smile. "And actually, I think your relationship might be more of an asset than a liability in the long run. You're living proof that peaceful coexistence is possible, that people from different backgrounds can find common ground and build something beautiful together." As the sun began to set behind the western mesas, painting the sky in shades of rose, and gold that reminded Ayanna of the wedding dress she had worn on the day her life changed forever. Morrison and Crawford prepared to depart. But before they mounted their horses, the captain pulled Thomas aside for a private conversation while the governor spoke quietly with Ayanna. "I want you to know," Crawford said, his voice low but earnest, "that what you did this past summer, walking away from everything familiar to follow your conscience, that took tremendous courage. Not many people would have been willing to risk so much for their principles." "I didn't feel courageous at the time," Ayanna admitted. "I felt terrified. I was giving up everything I had ever known for the promise of something I couldn't even imagine. And yet you did it anyway," Crawford observed. "That's what real courage is, acting on your convictions despite your fear. I hope you'll consider our offer seriously. The territory needs people with that kind of moral clarity." Meanwhile, Morrison was having his own conversation with Thomas, their voices too low for Ayanna to overhear, but their body language suggesting serious discussion. When both conversations concluded and the visitors prepared to leave, Morrison paused to address them both. "Take your time deciding," he said. "This isn't the kind of opportunity that comes along often, but it's also not the kind of decision that should be made quickly. Talk it over. Think about what it would mean for your future together." After their guests had departed, Ayanna and Thomas stood together on their porch, watching the last light fade from the sky. The valley around them was peaceful, filled with the gentle sounds of evening, horses nickering in the corral, night birds beginning their songs, the distant howl of coyotes greeting the rising moon. "What do you think?" Thomas asked, his arm encircling her waist in a gesture that had become as natural as breathing. "I think," Ayanna said slowly, "that we've been given a chance to do something important. Something that could make a real difference in how our people see each other." "It wouldn't be easy," Thomas warned. "There would be travel, danger, political pressure from all sides. We'd be making ourselves targets for anyone who opposes better relations between whites and Apaches." Ayanna turned to face him, seeing in his eyes the same mixture of excitement and apprehension she felt in her own heart. "When I cut that ceremonial cord 3 months ago, I wasn't just choosing freedom from an unwanted marriage. I was choosing to believe that I could make my own decisions about what kind of life was worth living." "And what kind of life is that?" "One where I can use my freedom to help others find theirs," she replied without hesitation. "One where the fact that I belong to two worlds becomes a bridge instead of a burden." Thomas smiled, the expression transforming his weathered features with warmth and love. "Then I think we have our answer. Are you sure?" Ayanna asked. "This would mean giving up the privacy we've found here, the peace of building our own small world away from all the politics and prejudice." "I'm sure," Thomas said firmly. "Because our small world, beautiful as it is still just two people finding happiness together. What Governor Crawford is offering us is a chance to help create a larger world where more people might find the same kind of understanding we've discovered." That night, as they lay together in the bedroom of the house they had built with their own hands, Ayanna reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. 6 months ago, she had been a dutiful daughter preparing for a marriage that would sacrifice her individual desires for the greater good of her people. Tonight, she was a free woman in love with a man who valued her intelligence and independence, contemplating a future where she could serve that same greater good while remaining true to herself. The transformation had not been without cost. Her relationship with her father, while not completely severed, remained strained by her decision to abandon her prescribed role. Some members of her former band still viewed her choice as betrayal, while others had come to see her as a pioneer, blazing a trail toward a different kind of future for Apache women. Mato, for his part, had eventually remarried within his own band, choosing a woman who was content with the traditional role Ayanna had rejected. Their brief marriage had been officially dissolved according to Apache custom, freeing both of them to pursue the lives that suited their natures. There was no animosity between them now, only the recognition that they had been fundamentally unsuited for each other, despite the political advantages their union might have provided. "Are you awake?" Thomas whispered in the darkness. "Yes," Ayanna replied, turning toward him in their shared bed. "I was thinking about choice, about how different my life is now from what anyone expected it would become. Do you have any regrets?" The question was one they had discussed before, but it still deserved serious consideration. Ayanna thought of all the things she had given up, the security of belonging to a defined community, the pride of fulfilling traditional expectations, the simplicity of a life where major decisions were made by others. Against those losses she weighed the gains, the freedom to think and speak for herself, the joy of a love freely chosen rather than politically arranged, the opportunity to help shape a better future for both her peoples. "No regrets," she said finally. "Only gratitude for the courage to choose when the moment came." Thomas pulled her closer, his breath warm against her hair. "Tomorrow we'll send word to Governor Crawford, accepting his offer." "Tomorrow," Ayanna agreed, "we begin the next chapter of our story." But tonight, she was content to lie in the arms of the man who had offered her freedom without asking for anything in return. In the house they had built together, in the valley they had claimed as their own. Tonight, she was exactly where she belonged, not because tradition or politics or family obligation had placed her there, but because she had chosen to be there. Outside their window, the desert night stretched endlessly under a canopy of stars that had witnessed countless stories of love and loss, courage and cowardice, oppression and liberation. Somewhere among those distant lights, Ayanna imagined, other women were facing choices between duty and desire, between security and freedom, between the lives others wanted them to live and the lives they dared to dream for themselves, for all those women, for all the people on both sides of the cultural divide who still believed that understanding was possible, for all the children who might grow up in a world where love could cross any boundary and choice belonged to the individual rather than the group. Ayanna closed her eyes and whispered a prayer of gratitude to the spirits who had guided her to this moment. She had been born Ayanna, eternal blossom, daughter of Chief Nalnish, promised to war Chief Mata, bound by tradition and expectation to a life she never chose. But she had chosen to become something else entirely, a bridge between worlds, a voice for understanding, a woman who belonged fully to herself and freely to the man she loved. As sleep finally claimed her, Ayanna's last conscious thought was not of the past she had left behind, or even the challenging future that awaited them, but of the simple miracle of this present moment, lying beside someone who saw her as she truly was and loved her not. Despite her independence, but because of it. In the morning, they would write their acceptance letter to Governor Crawford and begin preparing for a new life of public service and private devotion. They would face criticism and danger, political pressure and personal attacks, the constant challenge of representing two cultures that were still learning to trust each other. But tonight, they were simply Thomas and Ayanna, two people who had found each other across a divide that many believed unbridgeable, who had discovered that love freely chosen was stronger than duty imposed, that freedom shared was more precious than security. Surrendered. In the valley between the mesas, under the endless southwestern sky, their small house stood as proof that some choices, however difficult, however costly, however impossible they might seem, were worth making. Some freedoms once claimed were worth any sacrifice to preserve, and some love stories, born from the courage to choose authenticity over expectation, became beacons lighting the way for others brave enough to follow their hearts toward the promise of a better world. The morning brought crisp autumn air and the kind of crystal-clear light that made the southwestern landscape seem to glow from within. Ayanna woke before Thomas, as had become her habit, and slipped quietly from their bed to stand at the window overlooking their valley. The cottonwoods along the creek had turned brilliant gold overnight, and the sight filled her with the kind of quiet joy she had never experienced in her previous life. In the months since her dramatic break from tradition, she had discovered aspects of herself that had been buried beneath layers of duty and expectation. She had always been intelligent, but now she could express that intelligence freely, engaging in discussions about politics, philosophy, and the future of the territory, without having to filter her thoughts through the constraints of what was appropriate for a chief's daughter to say. She had always been strong-willed, but now that strength could be directed toward goals she chose rather than obligations imposed by others. Most surprisingly, she had discovered a gift for languages that went far beyond her childhood facility. With English, Thomas had introduced her to Spanish through their Mexican neighbors, and she had found herself picking up the musical cadences and complex grammar with startling ease. More than that, she had begun to see connections between the three languages she now spoke, patterns of thought and expression that revealed how different peoples understood and organized their experiences of the world. This linguistic facility would prove invaluable in the position Governor Crawford had offered them. The territory was home not just to various Apache bands and Anglo settlers, but to Mexican families whose roots in the region went back centuries, to Pueblo peoples with their own complex cultures and languages, to traders and travelers from dozens of different backgrounds. The ability to communicate across these linguistic and cultural boundaries would be essential for anyone hoping to build lasting peace in such a diverse region. Thomas stirred behind her, and she turned to find him watching her with the expression of quiet contentment that had become familiar over their months together. Unlike the calculating appraisal she had received from Matu, Thomas's gaze held nothing but appreciation for who she was in this moment, hair loose around her shoulders, wearing the simple cotton nightgown she had sewn herself, standing in the golden morning light that streamed through their hand-built windows. "Planning to accept Crawford's offer?" he asked, his voice still rough with sleep. "Planning to change the world," she replied with a smile that held both determination and gentle humor. Starting with breakfast, their morning routine had evolved into a comfortable dance of shared responsibilities. Thomas went out to tend the horses and check the animals while Ayana prepared coffee and began cooking. But this morning, as she ground coffee beans and sliced bacon from their own smokehouse, her mind was occupied with larger questions about the future they were contemplating. The cultural liaison position would require them to travel extensively throughout the territory, mediating disputes, facilitating negotiations, and most importantly, educating people on all sides about the perspectives and concerns of their neighbors. It would mean staying in military posts and territorial offices, in Apache villages and Mexican settlements, always representing the possibility of peaceful coexistence in places where such possibilities were often viewed with skepticism or outright hostility. There would be personal risks as well. Ayana was acutely aware that her relationship with Thomas made her a symbol of cultural mixing that many people found threatening. Some Apache traditionalists viewed her as a woman who had abandoned her people for the enemy, while some white settlers saw her as a potential spy or saboteur who could never be fully trusted. The fact that she and Thomas were not yet legally married only complicated matters further, though they had been discussing that possibility as well. Marriage between an Apache woman and a white man required navigating a complex web of legal and social obstacles. Territorial law technically permitted such unions, but social acceptance was another matter entirely. More practically, Apache women who married outside the tribe traditionally lost their tribal status, while their children occupied an uncertain position between two worlds that might accept or reject them, depending on circumstances. Thomas returned from his morning chores, carrying a pail of fresh milk from their cow, and wearing the expression of a man who had been thinking seriously about something. "I've been considering Crawford's offer," he said as he set the milk on their kitchen table. And I think we need to talk about some practical matters before we commit ourselves. Ayanna nodded, gesturing for him to sit while she poured coffee into the ceramic mugs they had bought from a traveling Mexican potter. I've been thinking about the same things. The risks, the complications, the ways this position could affect not just us, but our families and communities. Your father, for instance, Thomas said carefully. How do you think he would react to news that his daughter had accepted an official government position? That she was speaking for Apache interests in territorial politics? The question touched on one of Ayanna's deepest concerns. Chief Nalnish had not disowned her after her dramatic departure from the wedding ceremony, but their relationship remained strained and complicated. He understood her reasons for rejecting the marriage to Mato, even respected her courage in following her conscience, but he struggled with the implications of her choice for other young Apache women who might be inspired to rebel against traditional arrangements. I think, Ayanna said slowly, that he would be proud of me for finding a way to serve our people while remaining true to myself. But I also think he would worry about the precedent it sets, about other daughters who might use my example to justify abandoning their responsibilities. And you? Do you worry about that? Ayanna considered the question while she turned bacon in the iron skillet, the familiar domestic task helping her organize her thoughts. I worry about young women who might think freedom means simply running away from difficult situations without having anywhere to run to. But I also believe that some traditions need to change if our people are going to survive in the world that's coming. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of a horse approaching at speed, its hoofbeats echoing off the valley walls with an urgency that immediately put both of them on alert. Visitors to their remote homestead were usually announced by the leisurely pace of people who had traveled far and were in no particular hurry to complete their journey. This rider was moving with purpose that suggested either emergency or very important news. Thomas stepped out onto the porch with the rifle he kept loaded by the door, while Ayanna remained in the kitchen but positioned herself where she could see through the window. The approaching rider was a young Apache man she recognized as Swifthorse, one of her father's most trusted scouts. His presence here, riding alone and clearly exhausted, could only mean that something significant had happened in her home village. Swift Horse dismounted near the porch and approached with the formal bearing of someone carrying an official message. His clothing and appearance suggested he had been riding hard for at least a day, possibly longer, and his horse showed similar signs of sustained effort. Thomas Brennan, he said in heavily accented English. I carry words from Chief Nalnish. For his daughter Ayanna. May I speak with her? Thomas stepped aside, and Ayanna appeared in the doorway, her heart racing with anxiety about what news could have prompted such urgent travel. Swifthorse's expression was grave but not tragic, suggesting serious business rather than disaster. Swifthorse, she said in Apache, relief evident in her voice at being able to use her native language. What message do you bring from my father? Honored daughter, Swifthorse replied formally, your father sends word that Mexican raiders have crossed into our territory and attacked 2 of our outlying camps. 7 of our people were killed, including women and children. The Mexican authorities claim our warriors violated the border treaty by pursuing stolen horses onto their land. The news hit Ayanna like a physical blow. Border raids between Apache bands and Mexican settlements had been a recurring problem for generations, with both sides claiming the other had violated various agreements and treaties. But the timing of this particular attack, coming just as she and Thomas were considering Crawford's offer, seemed almost deliberately calculated to test their commitment to peaceful solutions. What does my father request? She asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. He asks that you and Thomas Brennan come to the village to help negotiate with the Mexican authorities. Your man's knowledge of their language and customs, combined with your understanding of our ways, might prevent this incident from escalating into a larger conflict. Thomas had been following the conversation in Apache, his facility with the language having improved dramatically during their months together. "When did this attack occur?" he asked Swifthorse directly. 4 days ago. The Mexican officials are demanding a meeting within the week to discuss reparations and prevention of future incidents. Chief Nalnish believes this is an opportunity to establish better relations, but only if someone can speak for both sides with authority and understanding. Ayanna exchanged a meaningful look with Thomas. Here was their first test, their chance to discover whether the theoretical possibilities Crawford had outlined could work in practice. More than that, it was an opportunity for her to serve her people in a crisis, while demonstrating that her choice to leave traditional arrangements had not meant abandoning her responsibilities to her community. "We'll come," she said without hesitation. "Give us time to pack supplies and secure our animals, and we'll ride back with you today." Swifthorse nodded gratefully, accepting the cup of coffee and plate of food Ayanna offered him while they prepared for the journey. As she gathered clothes and supplies for what might be an extended stay in her home village, Ayanna found herself thinking about the circular nature of events that was bringing her back to the place she had left in such dramatic circumstances. When she had cut the ceremonial cord and walked away from her wedding, she had been fleeing toward an uncertain future, driven more by what she could not accept than by any clear vision of what she wanted to become. Now she was returning as someone who had discovered her own capabilities and chosen her own path, coming back not as a refugee seeking shelter but as someone with unique skills that might serve her people's needs. The ride to her father's village took the better part of 2 days, following mountain paths that Thomas had never traveled, but that Ayanna knew as well as the rooms of her childhood home. Swifthorse set a punishing pace, but both she and Thomas were in excellent physical condition from their months of ranch work, and they kept up without difficulty. As they rode, Thomas asked careful questions about Apache-Mexican relations, about the history of border conflicts, about the personalities and politics they would likely encounter during the negotiations. His approach was methodical and respectful, seeking to understand not just the facts of the situation, but the cultural context that would shape how all parties interpreted those facts. "The Mexicans see us as savages who can't be trusted to honor agreements," Ayanna explained as they rested their horses beside a mountain stream. "We see them as invaders who stole land that belonged to our ancestors and then claimed the right to punish us for trying to reclaim it. Both sides have enough historical grievances to justify almost any action they choose to take. And your father? What does he really want from these negotiations?" Ayanna considered the question while she watered her horse and refilled their canteens. "Peace, if it can be achieved with honor. But more than that, he wants to establish some kind of framework for preventing future incidents. He's old enough to remember when Mexican-Apache conflicts were just one problem among many. Now with white settlement increasing and the territorial government trying to establish control, he understands that we can't afford to fight wars on multiple fronts." The conversation was interrupted by Swifthorse's warning whistle from his position as lookout. All three of them immediately moved to defensive positions, hands on weapons, eyes scanning the surrounding landscape for signs of threat. But instead of raiders or soldiers, what emerged from the pine forest ahead of them was a small party of Mexican riders flying a white flag of truce. The Mexican delegation consisted of 3 men, a middle-aged official in formal civilian dress, a younger military officer, and an elderly man whose clothing and bearing suggested he was a local ranch owner or political leader. They approached slowly, hands visible and away from weapons, clearly hoping to avoid any misunderstandings that might provoke violence. "Senator Brennan?" the civilian official called out in Spanish when they were within speaking distance. "I am. Diego Vasquez, representing the territorial government of Chihuahua. We have been hoping to encounter you on the trail." Thomas responded in fluent Spanish, his tone respectful but cautious. "Senator Vasquez, this is unexpected. How did you know we would be traveling this route?" "Governor Crawford sent word that You and your companion might be willing to assist in resolving the current difficulties between our peoples. We have been waiting at the border for 3 days, hoping to speak with you before the formal negotiations begin." Ayana found herself impressed by the Mexican official's initiative in seeking out Thomas specifically, suggesting that Crawford's recommendation of their services had already reached influential ears on both sides of the border. More than that, the fact that the Mexicans were willing to ride into Apache territory under a flag of truce demonstrated a serious commitment to finding peaceful solutions. "What exactly are you proposing?" Thomas asked, maintaining his diplomatic tone while positioning himself where he could protect Ayana if the situation turned dangerous. "A preliminary meeting away from the formal setting of the village negotiations. A chance to understand each other's concerns and perhaps find common ground before emotions and politics make compromise impossible." Swift Horse was following the Spanish conversation with obvious difficulty, his expression growing increasingly concerned as he realized that major decisions were being made in a language he couldn't understand. Ayana quickly translated the key points into Apache, including her own assessment that the Mexican offer seemed genuine and potentially valuable. After a brief consultation between the 3 Apache party members, they agreed to the Mexican proposal. The preliminary meeting would take place at an abandoned trading post roughly halfway between the Apache village and the Mexican border town, neutral ground that belonged fully to neither side. The trading post had once been a thriving center of commerce where Apache, Mexican, and American traders had gathered to exchange goods and information. Now it stood empty, its adobe walls weathered but still solid, its corrals and storage buildings serving as monuments to more peaceful times. The symbolism of the location was not lost on any of the participants. Here was proof that cooperation between their peoples was possible, even if it had been disrupted by conflicts and changing political circumstances. The negotiations that followed over the next 3 days were unlike anything Ayana had ever experienced. Instead of the formal, ritualized exchanges she was accustomed to from Apache councils, these discussions were fluid, dynamic, constantly shifting between languages and cultural frameworks as different parties tried to make their perspectives understood. Thomas proved to be a masterful mediator, able to translate not just words but concepts across cultural boundaries. When Mexican officials spoke of property rights and legal jurisdiction, he helped Apache participants understand the underlying concerns about security and compensation. When Apache speakers talked about traditional hunting grounds and spiritual connections to the land, he found ways to explain these concepts that Mexican listeners could comprehend and respect. But it was Ayana who provided the breakthrough that made real progress possible. On the second day of discussions, when tensions were rising and both sides seemed ready to abandon the negotiations, she stood up and spoke directly to the assembled group in Spanish. "Senores," she said, her accent careful but her meaning clear, "we are arguing about the past when we should be planning for the future. Yes, there have been raids and counter-raids, violations and retaliation, grievances on all sides. But what will our children inherit if we cannot find a way to live as neighbors rather than enemies?" The Mexican officials were visibly startled to hear an Apache woman speaking their language fluently, but their surprise quickly gave way to attention as she continued. "I was raised to believe that Mexicans were enemies who could never be trusted. You were probably raised to believe that Apaches were savages who could never be civilized. But here we sit together, talking instead of fighting, seeking solutions instead of victory. Perhaps it is time to raise our children with different beliefs." The speech, delivered with passion but also with the diplomatic skill she had been developing, shifted the entire tone of the negotiations. Instead of focusing on assigning blame for past incidents, the discussions began to center on practical measures for preventing future conflicts, regular communication between border communities, joint patrols to track raiders from either side, and economic incentives for cooperation rather than conflict. By the end of the third day, They had reached an agreement that satisfied no one completely, but offered everyone something valuable. The Mexicans received assurances that Apache leaders would work actively to prevent raids across the border. The Apaches gained recognition of their legitimate grievances and commitments to better protection for their people when they traveled or traded in Mexican territory. Most importantly, both sides established ongoing mechanisms for communication and dispute resolution that might prevent future incidents from escalating into open warfare. The return journey to her father's village gave Ayana time to reflect on what they had accomplished and what it meant for the future she and Thomas were contemplating. The negotiations had been exhausting but exhilarating, confirming her belief that real solutions to complex problems required people who could understand multiple perspectives and communicate across cultural boundaries. More than that, the experience had shown her how much she had grown during her months of freedom. The young woman who had stood silently during formal gatherings, while men discussed important matters, could never have delivered the speech that had changed the course of the negotiations. That transformation had been possible only because she had claimed the right to think and speak for herself. Chief Nalnish received them at his village with a mixture of pride and amazement that his daughter had played such a crucial role in resolving the Mexican crisis. But Ayana could see in his eyes something more complex than simple paternal satisfaction, a recognition that she had found a way to serve her people that honored both their traditions and her own need for independence. "You have done well, my daughter," he said during their private conversation after the formal reception, celebrating the successful negotiations. "You have found a way to use the gifts the spirits gave you in service of something larger than yourself." "I learned from you, Father," she replied. "You always taught me that leadership meant putting the welfare of the people before personal desires. I've simply found a different way to apply that principle. And this man, this Thomas Brennan," Chief Nalnish continued, studying her face carefully, "he treats you well? He respects your intelligence and your strength? He loves me for who I am, not for who he thinks I should become," Ayana answered. "And more than that, he believes I can accomplish things that I never imagined possible." "Chief." Nalnish nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. "When you cut the cord that bound you to Mato, I feared you were choosing selfishness over duty. Now I see that you were choosing a different kind of duty, one that could serve our people in ways that traditional marriage never could." That evening, as the village celebrated the peaceful resolution of the border crisis, Ayana and Thomas sat together beside the fire where she had once listened to her grandmother's stories about the old times when the people had been forced to adapt or perish. The parallel was not lost on her. Once again, survival required transformation, the courage to become something new while preserving what was most valuable from the past. "Crawford was right about one thing," Thomas said as they watched the dancers move in the firelight. "You have a gift for this kind of work. What you did during those negotiations, the way you found words that both sides could hear and accept, that's not something that can be taught." "Perhaps not," Ayana agreed. "But it can be developed, refined, put to better use. And that's what Crawford is offering us, isn't it? The chance to turn what we've learned about each other into something that might help others find their own paths toward understanding." The next morning brought another messenger, this time a territorial courier carrying an official letter from Governor Crawford. The correspondence was addressed to both Thomas and Ayana, formally offering them positions as special cultural liaisons with the territorial government, with authority to mediate disputes, facilitate negotiations, and develop programs to improve relations between diverse communities throughout the region. The salary offered was generous, the authority substantial, and the potential for meaningful impact enormous. But perhaps most importantly, the position recognized Ayana as an equal partner in the work rather than merely Thomas's assistant or translator. She would have her own title, her own responsibilities, her own sphere of authority. "Are you ready?" Thomas asked as they prepared their response to Crawford's offer. "I've been ready since the morning I chose freedom over security," Ayanna replied. "The question is whether the territory is ready for what we might accomplish together." As they drafted their letter of acceptance, Ayanna thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment. From dutiful daughter to reluctant bride to independent woman to partner in both love and work. Each transformation had required courage, but also the support of people who believed in her potential to become more than. Circumstances seemed to allow. Now, she was embarking on perhaps the greatest transformation of all, from someone who had claimed freedom for herself to someone who might help others discover their own paths, toward liberation from the constraints of prejudice, misunderstanding, and fear. The letter was sent with the returning courier, carrying their acceptance of positions that would make them the first officially recognized intercultural mediators in territorial history. But even as they committed themselves to this new chapter of their lives, Ayanna and Thomas knew that their real work had already begun. In the quiet conversations that built trust across cultural boundaries, in the patient translation of ideas that seemed impossible to communicate, in the daily demonstration that love and respect could flourish between people who had been taught to see each other as enemies. Their small ranch in the valley would remain their home base, the place they returned to between assignments, the sanctuary where they could simply be Thomas and Ayanna rather than special cultural liaisons. But their true home had become something larger, the growing community of people on all sides who believed that peace was possible, that understanding could be achieved, that the future might be different from the painful past. As winter settled over the mountains and their first official assignment approached, Ayanna stood once again at the window of their bedroom, looking out at the snow-covered landscape that had become as dear to her as the red rocks of her childhood. But now, instead of seeing only the beauty of their private sanctuary, she saw the beginning of something that might transform the entire territory, a network of relationships built on mutual respect rather than mutual fear. A community where children might grow up speaking multiple languages and understanding multiple perspectives. A place where love could cross any boundary and freedom belonged to anyone brave enough to claim it. The work ahead would be difficult, dangerous, and sometimes heartbreaking. But it would also be the most meaningful thing she could imagine doing with the freedom she had fought so hard to achieve. And she would be doing it alongside the man who had shown her that love freely given was more powerful than any obligation, imposed by tradition or necessity. In the end, perhaps that was what freedom really meant, not the absence of responsibility, but the power to choose responsibilities that aligned with one's deepest values and highest aspirations. Ayanna had chosen to be responsible for building bridges between divided communities, for proving that understanding was possible even across the deepest cultural chasms, for demonstrating that some dreams were worth any sacrifice to achieve. Choice had been hers to make, and now the consequences, both the challenges and the rewards, would be hers to embrace. Their first official assignment as special cultural liaisons came sooner than expected. Governor Crawford's urgent telegram arrived 3 weeks after they had accepted their positions, requesting their immediate assistance with a situation developing near the mining town of Silver Creek, a dispute between Pueblo farmers and Anglo miners over water rights had escalated to the point where violence seemed inevitable, and local authorities feared that any incident might spread to involve other communities throughout the region. The journey to Silver Creek took them through some of the most spectacular country in the territory. But Ayanna found herself too preoccupied with the challenges ahead to fully appreciate the landscape. This would be their first test as official representatives of the territorial government, their first chance to prove that the intercultural mediation approach could work in practice rather than just in theory. Thomas shared her nervousness, though he expressed it differently. Where Ayanna tended to become quiet and thoughtful when facing uncertainty, Thomas became more talkative, thinking out loud about strategy and tactics as they rode through the pine forests and across the high meadows that surrounded Silver Creek. The water rights issue is complicated enough, he mused as they made camp on their second night of travel. But we'll also be dealing with fundamental questions about land use, traditional versus commercial agriculture, and the rights of indigenous communities versus the economic interests of territorial development. Ayanna nodded while she prepared their simple dinner over the campfire. And underneath all of that will be the deeper question of whether different peoples can share the same resources without one group driving out all the others. Exactly. Which means we're not just mediating a dispute about water, we're trying to establish principles that could govern how this territory develops for generations to come. The weight of that responsibility was both daunting and energizing. Ayanna had always understood that their work would have implications beyond the specific conflicts they were asked to resolve, but hearing Thomas articulate it so directly made her realize just how ambitious Crawford's vision for their positions really was. They reached Silver Creek the following afternoon to find a town balanced on the edge of chaos. The main street was divided by an invisible but unmistakable line, with Anglo miners and their families occupying the businesses and saloons on one side, while Pueblo representatives and their supporters gathered in the plaza on the other. Armed men from both groups stood in doorways and at street corners, their hands resting casually but meaningfully on weapons, their eyes tracking every movement of potential opponents. The local sheriff, a harried-looking man named Bill Henderson, met them at the town's single hotel with obvious relief. "Thank God you're here," he said without preamble. "I've got maybe 12 hours before somebody does something stupid and this whole situation explodes." "What exactly triggered the current crisis?" Thomas asked as Henderson led them toward the temporary headquarters he had established in the hotel's dining room. "Drought," Henderson replied grimly. "Worst in 20 years. The creek that both groups depend on is running maybe a quarter of its normal flow. The Pueblo farms upstream need every drop to save their crops, but the mines downstream need water for their operations. Nobody's willing to compromise because compromise means bankruptcy for somebody." Ayanna studied the maps and documents Henderson had assembled, trying to understand not just the technical aspects of the water dispute, but the human dynamics that had brought the situation to this crisis point. "How long have both groups been using water from this creek?" "The Pueblo people have been farming here for maybe 300 years, Henderson said. "The mines have been operating for about 5. Normally there's enough water for everybody, but this drought has changed everything. And both sides have legal claims to the water." Henderson's expression grew even more troubled. "That's where it gets complicated. The Pueblo farmers have traditional use rights that go back centuries, recognized by Spanish colonial law and Mexican territorial law. But the mining companies have territorial water permits issued by the current government. Technically, both claims are valid under different legal systems." Thomas and Ayanna exchanged a meaningful look. Here was exactly the kind of complex, multi-layered conflict that their positions had been created to address, a dispute that couldn't be resolved through simple application of law because multiple legal traditions were in conflict, where cultural misunderstanding was preventing the kind of creative problem-solving that the situation demanded. "We'll need to speak with representatives from both sides," Ayanna said. "But separately at first, to understand their real concerns and bottom-line needs before we bring them together." Henderson nodded gratefully. "I've got meetings set up for this evening. The mine owners will meet with you at 7, the Pueblo leaders at 8. They're both willing to talk, but they're not willing to be in the same room together until somebody can guarantee it won't turn into a shooting match." The evening meetings revealed the depth of mistrust and misunderstanding that had developed between the two communities. The mine owners, led by a shrewd businessman named Marcus Webb, viewed the Pueblo farmers as obstacles to legitimate economic development, people clinging to outdated traditions that prevented the territory from realizing its full potential. "These people have been scratching out subsistence farms in this valley for generations," Webb argued during his presentation to Thomas and Ayanna. We're offering real economic development, jobs for hundreds of workers, tax revenue for the territorial government. It's progress versus stagnation, the future versus the past. But when they met with the Pueblo leaders an hour later, a completely different picture emerged. Elder Joseph Martinez, speaking for his community, described farming techniques refined over centuries to work with the natural rhythms of the land. Agricultural practices that had sustained his people through countless droughts and provided food security for hundreds of families. The miners see only water flowing in a creek, Martinez explained through careful English supplemented by occasional Spanish phrases. We see the blood of the earth, the gift of the spirits that makes life possible in this hard country. Take away our water, and you take away our ability to feed our children, to maintain the connection to this place that defines who we are as a people. The contrast between these perspectives was stark, but Ayanna began to see possibilities for bridging the gap. Both groups were concerned about survival, economic survival for the miners, cultural and physical survival for the farmers. Both were fighting for their vision of what the territory's future should look like. The challenge was finding a way for both visions to coexist. What if the solution isn't about choosing between mining and farming? She suggested to Thomas as they walked back to their hotel after the meetings, but about finding ways to make both more efficient and sustainable. Water conservation techniques, you mean? Improved irrigation for the farms, recycling systems for the mines? That, and also looking at ways the two operations might actually support each other rather than competing for the same resources. Thomas stopped walking and turned to look at her with the expression of someone whose thinking had just been redirected in a completely new direction. The farms could supply food for the mining camps, reducing transportation costs and creating a local market for agricultural products. And the mines could provide employment for younger Pueblo men during seasons when farm work is light, giving families additional income while maintaining their connection to the land. The idea was promising, but implementing it would require overcoming generations of mistrust and mutual incomprehension. Over the next 3 days, Thomas and Ayanna worked tirelessly to develop the relationships and understanding that would make such cooperation possible. They spent mornings with the Pueblo farmers, learning about traditional irrigation techniques and sustainable agricultural practices that had enabled survival in this arid environment for centuries. Ayanna's ability to communicate in Spanish proved invaluable, allowing her to connect with older community members who had learned that language during the Mexican period and felt more comfortable expressing complex ideas in Spanish than in English. Afternoons were devoted to the mining operations, where Thomas's technical background helped him understand the engineering challenges of extracting precious metals while minimizing water consumption. The mine owners were initially skeptical of advice from government mediators, but they gradually recognized that Thomas and Ayanna were genuinely interested in finding solutions that would benefit everyone rather than simply imposing compromises. That satisfied no one. Evenings were spent in careful planning sessions, developing proposals that could address the immediate water crisis while establishing frameworks for long-term cooperation. The breakthrough came when Ayanna suggested organizing a joint meeting around a shared meal, using food as a bridge between communities that had been viewing each other as enemies. Breaking bread together changes the entire dynamic of a negotiation, she explained to the skeptical participants from both sides. It's hard to see someone as a threat to your survival when you're sharing food they helped prepare. The feast that resulted was a revelation for everyone involved. Pueblo women prepared traditional dishes using ingredients that demonstrated the productivity and sustainability of their farming methods, while mining families contributed foods that represented their own cultural backgrounds and culinary traditions. Children from both communities played together in the plaza while their parents discovered shared concerns about education, safety, and the future of the territory. More importantly, the relaxed atmosphere of the shared meal created opportunities. for informal conversations that revealed common interests and mutual respect that formal negotiations had failed to uncover. Marcus Webb found himself fascinated by the sophisticated understanding of hydrology that underlay traditional Pueblo irrigation techniques, while Joseph Martinez was impressed by the engineering innovations that allowed the mines to operate efficiently in such challenging terrain. By the end of the evening, both sides had agreed to a revolutionary cooperative arrangement. The Pueblo farmers would modernize their irrigation systems using techniques adapted from mining engineering, reducing their water consumption while actually increasing their agricultural productivity. In return, the mining companies would invest in water recycling technologies that would allow them to operate using significantly less fresh water from the creek. More ambitiously, the two communities agreed to establish a joint agricultural cooperative that would supply food to the mining camps while providing guaranteed income for Pueblo farmers. Young men from the farming community would have opportunities for part-time employment in the mines, gaining technical skills and cash income, while maintaining their connections to traditional agricultural life. The agreement was formalized in a ceremony that combined elements from both cultures: Pueblo blessings for the water and land with Anglo legal documents that would be recognized by territorial courts. Thomas and Ayanna served as witnesses and interpreters, but the real work of reconciliation was done by community members who discovered that their supposed enemies were actually potential partners in building a more prosperous and sustainable future. The success at Silver Creek established Thomas and Ayanna's reputation throughout the territory as mediators who could achieve results where traditional diplomatic approaches had failed. Over the following months, requests for their services came from mining towns and farming communities, from military posts and trading centers, from anywhere that different cultural groups were struggling to coexist in the rapidly changing landscape of territorial development. Each assignment brought new challenges and new opportunities to refine their approach to intercultural mediation. They learned to recognize the underlying fears and hopes that drove surface-level conflicts, to identify shared values that could serve as foundations for cooperation, to develop creative solutions that honored different cultural traditions while meeting practical needs. But perhaps more importantly, their work began to create a network of relationships across the territory. People from different backgrounds who had worked together successfully and could serve as bridges when new conflicts arose. The Silver Creek Cooperative became a model that other communities sought to emulate, while the individuals who had participated in those early negotiations often reached out to help mediate disputes in their own regions. By the end of their first year as special cultural liaisons, Thomas and Ayanna had developed what Governor Crawford would later describe as a new model for territorial governance, one based on inclusion rather than domination, on cooperation rather than competition, on the belief that diversity could be a source of strength rather than a threat to stability. Their personal relationship had deepened and matured alongside their professional partnership. The challenges of their work had tested their commitment to each other in ways that peaceful ranch life never could have, revealing reserves of mutual support and understanding that surprised them both. They had learned to function as a team in high-pressure situations, each complementing the other's strengths while compensating for their weaknesses. More than that, they had discovered that their love for each other was enhanced rather than threatened by their shared commitment to Puthacovard, something larger than themselves. The work they did together gave additional meaning to their relationship, while their relationship provided the emotional foundation that made their demanding work sustainable. As winter approached, and they returned to their ranch for a brief period of rest and planning, Ayanna reflected on how much her life had changed since that morning when she had stood on the canyon rim contemplating a future that seemed predetermined and inescapable. The woman who had once faced the choice between an unwanted marriage and an uncertain freedom had become someone who created new possibilities for others facing similar impossible situations. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't offered me that choice. She asked Thomas one evening as they sat by their fireplace, planning their next assignment. Every day, he admitted. But not because I regret what happened. Because I can't imagine any other life being as meaningful as the one we've built together. Ayanna reached for his hand, feeling the calluses that came from their ranch work and the ink stains that marked their hours spent writing reports and correspondence. These were the hands that had offered her freedom when she needed it most, that had supported her as she learned to use that freedom constructively, that had worked alongside hers to build something neither of them could have achieved alone. Outside their window, snow was beginning to fall on the valley that had become their sanctuary and their launching point for work that was transforming the entire territory. Tomorrow they would begin preparing for their next assignment, a complex dispute involving railroad development through traditional hunting grounds that would require all their skills and more. But tonight, they were simply Thomas and Ayanna, two people who had found each other across cultural boundaries that many considered unbridgeable, who had chosen love over fear and cooperation over conflict, who had discovered that some freedoms were worth any sacrifice to achieve and any effort to preserve. The choice that had begun with severing a ceremonial cord had grown into something larger than either of them had imagined, a new way of being in the world that honored both individual liberty and collective responsibility, that proved daily that understanding was possible even across the deepest divides, that offered hope to anyone brave enough to believe that the future could be different from the past. In the end, perhaps that was the most important freedom of all, the freedom to hope, to work for change, to believe that love and understanding could triumph over hatred and fear. It was a freedom that belonged to anyone willing to choose it, anyone ready to pay the price that genuine transformation always demanded. And as snow continued to fall outside their window, covering the landscape in pristine white that made everything seem possible again, Ayanna knew that she and Thomas would continue choosing that freedom, day after day, for as long as their strength and courage lasted. Because some choices, once made with full commitment and clear intention, became not burdens to be carried, but wings that could lift not only the chooser, but everyone whose life they touched toward the promise of a better world. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from US.